Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. I arrived at the hospital in San Ignacio in the middle of a storm that seemed to rip the sky to shreds. It was a rural hospital, isolated on a hill between dirt roads and endless fields, with an air of abandonment that unsettled me from the start. The windows were opaque, the corridors too narrow, and the walls had gone years without a coat of paint. Still, I was grateful for the opportunity. As a newly graduated physician, I couldn't afford to be picky. The atmosphere was heavy from day one. The hospital lights were yellow, flickering, and the hallways seemed to exhale an eerie silence, as if no one dared speak louder than a whisper. It didn't take long for me to notice that the staff avoided making eye contact and smiles were a rarity. But what really caught my attention was him, Nurse Sebastian. He was a tall, thin man with meticulous movements and an almost imperceptible voice. His dark, sunken eyes seemed to watch everything without blinking, and he always wore his immaculate uniform. No one in the hospital seemed to want to get any closer to him than necessary, and for some reason, that fact awakened a strange discomfort in me. There was something about the way he moved through the rooms, silent as a shadow, that made the air become thicker around him. My first few days were spent among patients with common ailments and minor emergencies, nothing out of the ordinary. But a week later, I began to notice a pattern that made my blood run cold. The first case was an elderly woman admitted for a mild respiratory infection. When I last saw her, she was stable, even joking with me about how she wanted to go back to tending her vegetable garden. The next day, she showed up at the morgue. Unexpected cardiac arrest, they said. It seemed strange to me, but I didn't ask questions. The second case was a young man in his 30s with a complicated fracture. He was recovering well, but just 48 hours later, he died of a suspected embolism. Then a child with appendicitis, a woman with severe migraines, a man with burns on his leg. The list grew. What disturbed me most was not the deaths themselves, although there were already too many for such a small hospital, but the fact that they always happened under the same circumstances. They all occurred during the night, and Sebastian was the nurse on duty in each case. It could not be a coincidence. I began to pay more attention. I noticed that Sebastian never flinched at bad news. While other staff members muttered to each other or exchanged nervous glances, he went about his routine as if nothing had happened. His countenance remained impassive, as if the deaths were as inevitable as the rain that kept falling on the hospital. My suspicions grew when I reviewed the medical records of the deceased. All had received drugs administered by Sebastian shortly before their deaths. Most were apparently harmless doses, sedatives, painkillers, anticoagulants. But something didn't add up. There were inconsistencies in the notes, small discrepancies that might go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking for something. A higher than usual dose here, an unrecorded administration there. I tried to share my concerns with the floor manager, but his response was evasive. He told me that mistakes could happen, that the nurses were overworked. He urged me not to look for problems where there were none. However, something in his look gave away that he knew more than he was willing to admit. That night, I decided to stay at the hospital beyond my shift. I settled in the break room with a cup of cold coffee and a notebook in which I jotted down the names of all the patients who had died under suspicious circumstances. The hours passed slowly, and the silence of the hospital grew more oppressive with every minute. Outside, the storm continued to batter the windows, and the sound of the wind seemed to whisper warnings that I could not understand. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps. It was Sebastian. I saw him walking toward a room down the hall, carrying a tray of medicine. I decided to follow him at a safe distance. I stopped in front of the half-open door and watched as he approached the patient, an elderly man convalescing after abdominal surgery. Sebastian adjusted the IV, checked the vitals on the monitor, and then pulled a syringe from his pocket. What I saw transfixed me. Sebastian injected the contents of the syringe into the patient's IV with terrifying calm. He then stood for a few seconds watching the man, as if waiting for something. Finally, he left the room without noticing my presence. I felt my heart pounding so hard that I feared he could hear it from the hallway. I ran to the patient. I checked the IV and confirmed that there was something out of place. The fluid had a different, barely perceptible hue. I removed it immediately and called a trusted nurse to help me replace it. That night, that man did not die. The next morning, I took the serum to an outside laboratory for analysis. The results confirmed my fears. There were traces of a toxic compound, enough to cause cardiac arrest without leaving too many traces. It was a poison. The weight of that revelation hit me like a cold wave. Sebastian was not just a lone nurse, he was a killer. A predator who operated with impunity in the corridors of the hospital. What I didn't understand was why. What motivated him? Why these particular patients? My subsequent nights were filled with insomnia and paranoia. I knew I couldn't accuse him without hard evidence, and I also knew that if he suspected me, I could be his next victim. I felt his gaze on me at all times, as if he knew I knew. There was something about the way he walked near me, the way he stopped at doorways, that made me feel like prey. I made up my mind, summoned the courage to talk to the local authorities. I gave them the lab results and my detailed notes on the suspicious deaths. At first, they seemed skeptical, but agreed to launch an investigation. In the meantime, they advised me to act normally, not to do anything that might alert Sebastian, but he already knew. The night before the police arrived, I found him waiting for me in the hospital parking lot. The storm was still raging, and the only light came from a flickering streetlight. Sebastian stood there in the rain, motionless, his uniform soaked through and his face expressionless. He said nothing, but there was something in his eyes that made me understand that he didn't need words. His message was clear. I was next. That was the last time I saw him. When the police arrived, Sebastian had disappeared. They searched his house, his lockers, but found nothing incriminating. It was as if he had never existed. However, the deaths stopped after he left, and the hospital returned to a tense calm. I left San Ignacio soon after. I could not bear to continue working in a place where lives were so fragile, so easily taken. But I have never been able to forget Sebastian, nor the blacklist of patients he left in his wake. Sometimes I wonder where he is now, if he has found another hospital, another place to lurk in the shadows. And I wonder if his blacklist is still growing. The real estate business has its charm. I always thought it was a simple job, show properties, close deals, and enjoy the commissions. But over the years, I learned that houses have stories, and some of those stories are too dark to ignore. It all started when I was assigned a property lot in a rural area on the outskirts of town. It was a collection of scattered houses, set far apart from each other, mostly surrounded by brush and woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight even on the clearest of days. The company had acquired these properties en bloc, and my task was to make them attractive to buyers. An easy opportunity, I thought, until I began to notice the pattern. The first house was a dilapidated villa on top of a hill. According to the paperwork, it had belonged to a young couple who had disappeared 3 years ago. The case was unsolved, but the police had ruled out a violent crime. They found no trace of a struggle and no concrete evidence. It was as if they had gone for a walk and never returned. Around the property, the underbrush was so overgrown that I could barely reach the porch without stumbling. Inside, the house was mostly intact, as if the owners had simply left on the spur of the moment. The dining room table still had dishes on it, and in the living room I found children's toys gathering dust, although there was no record of children in the family. As I explored, I noticed an oppressive silence. Even outside, the forest seemed to absorb any sound. I checked the condition of the house, noted the necessary repairs, and sent the report to the company. I didn't give it any more thought, but something about the atmosphere there made me uneasy. The second property was in a valley, surrounded by a wide field and a dirt road that crumbled in the constant rain that season. According to the history, the owner had been an older man, a well-known hermit in the area. No one had seen him in months, until his mail carrier noticed mail piling up. When the police went in, they found nothing unusual, just an empty house. As I inspected the place, I was struck by the meticulousness with which everything was arranged. There was an almost unnatural cleanliness, as if someone had erased any trace of life. But what puzzled me the most was a basement that I accessed after forcing a locked door. There, I found what appeared to be rusted farm tools, ropes, and several stains on the floor that I could not identify with certainty. I tried not to think too much about it, but something in that basement gave me a chill that I couldn't shake for days. After visiting 5 similar properties, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The former owners always disappeared under strange circumstances with no signs of obvious violence or logical explanations. The houses seemed to absorb their histories, standing as monuments to interrupted lives. I couldn't help but feel there was a connection, something that went beyond simple coincidences. I decided to investigate on my own. I reviewed public records, read police reports, and discreetly interviewed nearby neighbors. What I discovered only added to my unease. Although the disappearances seemed unrelated on the surface, there were details that tied the stories together. At all the properties, strange noises had been reported prior to the disappearances, and in each case the owners had mentioned someone interested in buying or visiting the house just before they disappeared. The description of this visitor always varied, but there was one thing in common: an insistent, almost invasive demeanor and an inordinate interest in the details of the properties. One day, while checking out one of the outlying houses, I found something I wasn't expecting. A folder hidden in a compartment under the kitchen floor. It contained photos of several properties, including the ones I was trying to sell. The pictures showed the former owners, always in everyday scenes, as if someone had been watching them. There were handwritten notes, lists of dates and times, and a map with locations marked, including one I didn't immediately recognize. That location led me to an old abandoned warehouse in the middle of the forest, which could only be reached by a narrow, muddy path. The rain made progress difficult, but my curiosity was stronger than my instinct for self-preservation. The warehouse was in ruins, with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. Upon entering, the air was thick with moisture and something else, a metallic smell I couldn't identify. What I found there I will never forget. In one of the back rooms was a collection of files and personal items belonging to the missing persons. There were clothes, documents, family photographs, all carefully organized as if someone had collected trophies. But the worst was to find a series of recordings, old videotapes showing disturbing scenes. People tied up, terrified, being interrogated by someone who never showed his face. The voice, however, was cold and methodical, as if it were all part of an experiment. It was at that moment that I understood that I was not alone. I heard a rustling behind me, and my heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but saw no one. However, I knew someone was watching me. I left everything as it was and left the warehouse as fast as I could, feeling every shadow following me. I got to my car soaking wet from the rain and drove without looking back, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to accept. Over the next few days, my paranoia grew. I felt I was being watched, that someone knew I had been in that warehouse. My email began to fill up with strange messages, some with veiled threats, others with pictures of the very houses I was trying to sell. One night, I found marks on my front door, as if someone had tried to break in. That's when I made a risky decision. I compiled everything I had found, the photos, the documents, and recorded a video detailing my findings. I sent it to several reputable journalists and the authorities, exposing what appeared to be a clandestine network using the properties for criminal activities. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was my only way out. The following weeks were chaotic. My report caused a media stir, and the authorities were forced to investigate. They discovered that the group behind these disappearances had been operating for years, using the houses to lure victims, erase their trail, and make profits that are still not fully understood. The leaders were arrested, and their methods exposed to the public. The properties became evidence, and the victims' families finally got answers. Although the network was dismantled, the marks of what I saw and experienced remain with me. I left the real estate business, but I can't help but look askance at every empty house I see. Some stories stay with you forever, and this one, though it ended fairly, taught me that even in the most everyday places, the deepest shadows can lurk. Sierra Frondosa National Park was a vast place full of life and silence. As a ranger, I had been hiking its trails for more than 2 decades, memorizing every bend in the terrain, every hidden creek, and every nook where animals sought refuge. Sierra Frondosa was my home as much as it was my workplace, but it also had its dark side. Deep inside, far from the marked trails, there were no-go areas, territories closed off for reasons that were rarely explained on maps. That part of the park was a void, a place that not even the most daring visitors dared to explore. The day I found it, the rain was about to come down. There were thick, overcast clouds gathering over the mountaintops, and the air was heavy with moisture. I was checking the perimeter when I saw something that shouldn't be there. An old backpack, weather-worn and partially covered by leaves. I approached it, and as I leaned over it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The backpack was broken, and next to it was something I couldn't ignore: bones. They were not recent remains, but neither were they so old as to be mistaken for animal remains. They were half buried, as if someone had tried to hide them in a hurry. There was a skull, parts of ribs, and what appeared to be vertebrae. All around them, the ground was covered with thick moss, as if nature was trying to reclaim what had been left behind. My first reaction was to report it immediately, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the location. It was inside one of the no-go zones, an area where even rangers were not allowed to enter without special authorization. For years, those restrictions had been vaguely explained: landslide risks, fragile ecosystems, conservation reasons. But there had never been any serious inspection or specific warnings beyond orders to avoid entry. That night, I couldn't sleep. Images of the bones and the backpack kept popping into my mind. I wondered who this person was, how he had gotten there, and why no one had noticed his absence. The next day, I decided to return to the site, this time more prepared. I took a camera, a flashlight, a notebook to take notes, and some basic equipment in case the storm got worse. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. The rain began to fall just as I entered the forest. As I progressed, the marked trails disappeared, and the vegetation became thicker. The silence was total, broken only by the crunching of my boots in the mud. It didn't take me long to realize that something was wrong. There were traces, broken branches, barely noticeable footprints in the mud, as if someone else had passed through recently. At first I thought maybe another ranger had patrolled that area without reporting, but the marks were too erratic, as if the person was running or running away from something. When I got to the spot where I had found the bones, I noticed that something had changed. The backpack was gone. Only the human remains remained, partially removed from the ground, as if someone had been there after me. Around the site, the ground was disturbed, with drag marks leading eastward, deeper into the forbidden zone. I debated whether to go back and report what I had found or follow the trail on my own. My instinct told me something big was going on, something I didn't want to be discovered. I decided to continue, guided by a mixture of curiosity and obligation. The trail led me to a clearing hidden among the trees. In the center was a structure that did not appear on the park maps, a small wooden hut, old but apparently inhabited. There were signs of recent life: a clothesline, a pile of dry firewood under a makeshift roof, and even a rusty bicycle leaning against a wall. But what really caught my attention was the smell. It was a pungent metallic stench coming from inside the hut. My heart was pounding as I circled the building. A small window was ajar, and from there I could see inside. There was a table with rusted surgical utensils, vials of unknown liquids, and what appeared to be pieces of bloody clothing. On the table, there was a detailed map of the park with markings in various zones, including prohibited areas. Next to it, I recognized a photograph of the backpack I had found. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing before I heard footsteps approaching. I hid behind some bushes, just as a figure appeared in the clearing. It was a man, probably in his 40s, dressed in mountain clothes and worn boots. He had a methodical gait, as if each step was calculated. He was carrying something in his hands, a rusty machete. He entered the cabin and closed the door. I waited for what seemed like hours before I dared to move. When the man finally came out, he was carrying a different backpack and headed into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I took advantage of his absence to enter the cabin. The smell was even stronger inside, almost unbearable. In a corner, I found what I feared: more human remains, this time in a more advanced state of decomposition. There were at least 2 bodies, partially covered with tarps and piled up as if they were garbage. At that moment, I knew I wasn't dealing with an accident or an oversight. This was premeditated. The cabin was the center of something much darker than I could have imagined. I checked the map on the table and saw that the markings coincided with places where other visitors had disappeared in recent years. Each dot was a clue connecting the deaths to this place. I couldn't stay any longer. I left the cabin and returned to the trail, doing my best to leave no trace of my presence. The rain kept falling, erasing the tracks behind me, which was both a blessing and a curse. While it helped me hide, it also made it harder to get my bearings. The forest felt different, more hostile, like it was alive and trying to get me. When I finally got back to the main park station, I tried to report what I had found, but it wasn't long before I realized that not all my colleagues were trustworthy. One of the supervisors listened to me too calmly, as if he already knew what I was saying. He asked me not to do anything until he could investigate it personally, but his reaction made me suspicious. That night, I decided to take the photographs I had managed to capture at the cabin and send them to a contact outside the park, someone I trusted completely. The next day, my supervisor called me to speak privately. He denied everything he had found, saying that there was no evidence of human remains and that the off-limits areas were harmless. His words were reassuring, but his eyes told me otherwise. It was then that I understood that I had touched a net bigger than I could handle alone. I didn't go back to work the next day. Instead, I packed up the essentials and left the park before anyone could stop me. The days that followed were a mixture of paranoia and despair. I couldn't get those images of the bodies out of my head, nor the possibility that they were trying to cover up the disappearances. Although I managed to share my story with some journalists, the information was met with skepticism. Who would believe that something so macabre was happening in one of the most protected parks in the country? But I know what I saw, and I know that there is still something hidden in Sierra Frondosa. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had followed orders and never entered the off-limits area. But then I remember the bones on the ground, the bodies in the cabin, and the man with the machete. There are secrets that the forest jealously guards, and sometimes the only way to survive is not to try to unearth them. When I accepted the position as a teacher in the village, I did so without much thought. After years in the city, the idea of working in a quiet place surrounded by mountains and away from the noise seemed like an opportunity to start over. The photographs I saw before arriving showed a picturesque landscape, small houses, a river crossing the valley, and a simple but functional school in the center of town. What they did not show was the weight of the place, something I discovered too late. I arrived one day in October, just as the first rains of the season were beginning to fall. The sky was covered with gray clouds that darkened the valley, and the air smelled of wet earth. The school was a single-story building with long, opaque windows. From the first moment, I sensed that something didn't fit. The silence was absolute, even when the children were playing in the playground. There was no laughter or shouting, just the sound of their footsteps in the mud. My students were a small group, just 15 children between the ages of 7 and 12. They all watched me with uneasy attention, their dark eyes fixed on me as if they were waiting for something. At first, I attributed their behavior to distrust of an outsider, but over time I realized there was more to it. They never smiled, and although they answered my questions, their voices were low and monotone, as if every word was forced out of them. When I sent them to recess, they simply stayed in their seats, staring at me or staring at the floor. One afternoon, while checking their homework, I noticed that most of their writing contained odd references. There were repeated words that did not fit the themes I had assigned them: blood, purification, loyalty. At first I thought these were coincidences or some game they had invented among themselves, but the more I analyzed it, the more disturbing it became. What really disturbed me was a drawing I found in one of the notebooks. It showed a circle with lines and symbols inside it, surrounded by human figures that appeared to be kneeling. Something about the precision of the lines, the way the figures were bent toward the center, sent a shiver down my spine. When I asked the boy who had drawn it, he simply looked at me silently, with an expression that belied his age. That night, as I was organizing my material in the small house I had been assigned, I heard a noise outside. I thought it was animals, but when I looked out the window, I saw a group of children standing in the middle of the street looking at me. They weren't moving, they weren't saying anything. They were just standing there, motionless in the rain. I closed the curtains and tried to convince myself that it was my imagination. The next few days were even stranger. Some kids started coming to class with small cuts or bruises on their hands and arms. When I asked them what had happened, they would say they had fallen or had been helping at home, but their answers were mechanical, as if they were reciting them. One day a girl came in with a bandaged finger. When I insisted on checking it, I noticed that the wound was deep, almost as if it had been done intentionally. Her eyes never left mine as she told me everything was fine. I decided to talk to the parents, but that only increased my concern. Most were reserved, almost sullen, and seemed annoyed by my questions. Some told me that the children were perfectly fine. Others simply slammed the door in my face. None showed any real concern about their children's injuries or strange behavior. One of the parents even warned me, in a curt tone, to stop meddling in matters that did not concern me. I began to investigate on my own, searching the town library and discreetly asking the few people with whom I had some trust. What I discovered was disturbing. The town had a dark history, marked by unexplained disappearances and rumors of ancient rituals dating back to the first settlers. It was said that every so often the inhabitants would offer something to ensure the prosperity of the valley and protect themselves from some sort of curse. Although the details were vague, references to human sacrifice were constant. The worst came one afternoon when I stayed late working in the classroom. The rain was coming down hard and the daylight had completely faded. Going through the desk drawers, I found a notebook I didn't recognize. Opening it, I felt my blood run cold. It contained a list of names, some crossed out, others underlined, along with dates that matched the disappearances recorded in the files I had consulted. Among the names, I saw one I recognized immediately: mine. It was underlined, and next to it was a date. It was in a week's time. Fear came over me, but also a desperate need to understand what was happening. That night, I decided to follow one of the children I had noticed more withdrawn. As he left the school, I saw him walking toward the outskirts of town, heading into the woods in the rain. I followed him at a distance, making sure not to be seen, until he came to a clearing where other children were gathered. What I saw in that clearing will haunt me forever. There was a circle marked on the ground similar to the one in the drawing I found in class, but larger and more elaborate. The children stood around it silent, while an adult, someone I didn't immediately recognize, muttered something under his breath. In the center of the circle was a dead animal, a kid, its blood running towards the marks on the ground. I watched in the gloom, feeling the cold of the rain soaking my body, until I noticed something else. One of the children was holding something in his hands, a small but sharp knife. The adult was guiding him, whispering words I couldn't hear, while the boy seemed to shiver. It was as if they were practicing something, a rehearsal for something worse. I couldn't stay any longer. I walked carefully away and returned home, my mind full of questions and growing fear. That night, I did not sleep. At dawn, I made the decision to leave town and report what I had seen to the authorities. But when I tried to leave, I discovered that my car wouldn't start. The engine was damaged, and when I checked it, I noticed that someone had cut the wires. They knew I wanted to leave. They knew I had seen something. I spent the next few days in a constant state of alert, waiting for an opportunity to escape. But the town was guarded in a subtle, almost invisible way. The children still attended class, but now they watched me with an intensity that terrified me. Their eyes seemed empty, but at the same time full of something I could not understand. And every time I saw their hands, I remembered the knife in the clearing. The night before the date marked in the notebook, I heard footsteps outside my house. I turned off all the lights and hid in the darkest corner, listening to someone knocking softly on the door. I don't know how long I stood there shivering until the sounds disappeared. The next day, when the time came, I gathered all the courage I could and went to school as if nothing had happened. There were no other options. I knew I could not escape without facing what was happening. When I arrived, the children were already in their seats, staring at me as if they were waiting. That was my last day in that place. I never heard from the town again, but I couldn't forget what I saw either. I made it out alive, but not without scars, not without the certainty that something dark was still going on in that place, under the constant rain and gray skies. Something that no outsider should ever discover. I always thought of computer security as a game of strategy, an intellectual challenge where the rules were clear. My job was to protect systems, detect vulnerabilities, and make sure sensitive data didn't fall into the wrong hands. So when I received that message, I saw it first as a curiosity rather than a threat. But things changed quickly, taking me to a darker place than I could have ever imagined. It was a gray afternoon and the rain was pounding hard on my office windows. I was finishing a project for a financial firm when a pop-up appeared on my screen. It had no sender or header, just text in hexadecimal code. The source was unknown, and although my security system didn't detect anything suspicious, something about the message made me uncomfortable. Deciphering it was not complicated, but what I found was disturbing. A link leading to an address on the dark web, a space where laws and morals seemed to have no place. As a security expert, I knew what it meant to enter that terrain. It was like walking barefoot in a minefield, but my curiosity got the better of me. Something about the message invited me to dig deeper, as if it was meant for me. The address took me to a simple, almost rudimentary site, with an interface reminiscent of the old internet forums. The black background contrasted with the white text that read, "Welcome to Murata Occulta." There were no clear directions, just a button that said "Login." Upon doing so, I was prompted for a code, and testing with the same hexadecimal text as the message, I agreed. What I found was frightening. It was a video file showing something I will never be able to erase from my mind. A dark room, illuminated only by a lamp on the ceiling, where several hooded people were sitting around a table. In the center, a man tied to a chair with his face covered in blood and eyes wild with fear. I could not hear anything, but the images spoke for themselves. He was tortured, interrogated, and then coldly murdered. When the video ended, a message appeared. "This is just the beginning." I closed the browser immediately, my heart pounding. For a few minutes I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it be an elaborate hoax, a setup to scare me? But something about the quality of the video, the details of the scene, made me doubt. It all seemed too real. In the days that followed, my life changed completely. My email was filled with coded messages, each one leading to more similar videos, each more disturbing than the last. The victims were different, but the people behind the masks seemed to be the same. I couldn't ignore what I was seeing, but I also didn't know how to proceed. Informing the authorities was an option, but what would I tell them? That I received an anonymous message that led me to uncover a network of heinous crimes? Without tangible evidence, they probably wouldn't do anything. What disturbed me most was when the messages began to include personal details about me. My address, the names of my friends, even pictures of places I frequented. It was as if they wanted me to know they were watching me. Paranoia began to take hold of me. I started checking my computer, looking for any malware or access points they had used to get my information, but I found nothing. My system was flawless, or so I thought. One night I received a different message. Instead of a link, it contained a physical address and a specific time. The text read, "Come if you want to know the truth." The address was in an industrial part of town, an area of abandoned factories I hadn't visited in years. I hesitated to go, but my curiosity overcame my fear. I packed my gear, including a camera to document anything I might find, and headed to the site in the pouring rain. The building was a concrete structure, its facade covered in graffiti and broken windows. I entered cautiously, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the void. In the center of the space, illuminated by a flickering light, was a laptop on a table. As I approached, the screen lit up and displayed a message, "Welcome to the core." As I logged on, I discovered an interface completely different from anything I had seen before. It was a complex system, designed to mask the identity and location of its users. Inside were files, hundreds of them, documenting the illicit activities of an organization operating in the shadows. Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, forced disappearances, and crimes so detailed that it seemed impossible that no one had ever discovered them before. Among the documents, I found something that chilled my blood. A file with my name on it. It contained records of my entire life, from my childhood to my most recent jobs. There were emails, phone calls, even screenshots of private conversations. Someone had been monitoring me for years, gathering information for a purpose I couldn't understand. It was then that I understood that I was not just a bystander in this network. I had been targeted for a reason, but I didn't know what. I decided to log out of the system, but when I tried to disconnect the computer, a final message appeared. No exit. I panicked. I felt that every shadow in that building was watching me, as if I was not alone. I ran for the exit, my heart pounding as the rain continued to fall heavily. When I got home, I tried to process what I had discovered. I knew I was in danger, but I didn't know to what extent. The next few days were hell. My email stopped working, my bank accounts were blocked, and I received messages on my phone reminding me that I was being watched. One night, while checking my home security cameras, I saw a figure standing in front of the door in the rain. He wasn't moving, just standing there looking at me. When I went out to confront him, no one was there, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. I decided to seek help, but every person I turned to seemed to turn away from me. My friends, my colleagues, even some contacts in law enforcement began to act distant, as if my presence was a risk to them. I realized I was alone, caught in a web I could neither understand nor destroy. The last message I received was a video. This time, the victim was me. It showed images of my life edited in a way that seemed to incriminate me in the very crimes I had discovered. I knew what it meant. They were coming full circle, preparing to use me as their next scapegoat. That night, I packed my things and disappeared. I left my life behind, changed my identity, and moved to a place where no one knew me. But even now, years later, I'm still looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment when they come back for me. Because in this world, the real terror is not ghosts or creatures of darkness. It is the invisible power of those who control the information and can destroy you without anyone stopping them. I never imagined that the day I would fly in the experimental aircraft would be the last day I would feel safe in the skies. For years, my life had revolved around aviation. As a test pilot, I had flown in all kinds of aircraft, from vintage models to state-of-the-art prototypes. I was used to the extreme sensations, the uncertainty of test flights, but what happened that day surpassed anything I had experienced before. The experimental aircraft in which I was to fly was a revolutionary design, a hang glider model with completely new electronic systems and an engine that promised to be the next big thing in aviation. It had passed the first inspections with no problems, and preliminary data from the simulators showed that everything was within safety margins. At first, everything seemed to be routine, but the little details I began to notice alerted me, although I didn't know at the time how close I was to a nightmare. The day had started like any other. The rain that had fallen in the early morning had stopped, but the sky was still overcast and humidity hung heavy in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. The test airport runway was empty, and the wind was blowing erratically, like a warning I still didn't understand. Entering the cockpit of the plane, everything was in place. The control panel displays glowed normally, the gauges seemed stable, and the communication systems were ready for flight. I made sure everything was ready. One last quick glance at the controls, controlled breathing, seatbelt safety. When the plane took off, the feeling was familiar. The roar of the engine, the vibration of the fuselage. The sound of aviation had always been my companion, my constant, and for a moment, all seemed well. The first few hours of the flight were quiet. As I climbed, I adjusted altitude and speed, checking systems, assessing how the aircraft was behaving. The model was impressive, almost as agile as a fighter, but with the smoothness of a commercial aircraft. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, everything within expected parameters. But just as I reached 10,000 meters, something unexpected happened. A slight tremor ran through the aircraft, and one of the monitors on the panel began to flicker. At first, I thought it might be a malfunction in the electrical system, something common in experimental aircraft. I didn't think much of it, but my experience told me something wasn't right. I checked the controls, tried to reset the connection, but the problem persisted. Then the shaking increased. The plane began to destabilize, as if something was pressing against the fuselage, an invisible force trying to wrest control from me. I tried to adjust the steering, but the control system became erratic. The plane jerked again, and suddenly everything went dead. Total silence, followed by a dull sound, like the hum of an overflowing machine. The engines began to fail. My heart raced. In my mind, the options quickly narrowed down. I was flying at high altitude, and because of the type of aircraft, I didn't have much time to decide what to do. The information displayed on the autopilot screen was full of errors, readings that didn't make sense. I was losing control. I tried to re-establish communication with the control tower, but the signal was cut off. No message, just static. I tried several times, more and more desperately, but the system was out of service. Not only was the plane failing, but so was my ability to receive outside help. I was all alone. The plane continued to lose altitude. The first few minutes were the worst, a constant struggle to keep my balance. Every little adjustment I tried on the controls seemed to have the opposite effect, and the speed of the descent kept increasing. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I began to visualize the options in my head. Should I attempt a crash landing? Was there a landing zone nearby? But the landscape below me was just a vast expanse of forests and mountains, an inhospitable terrain where any landing would be deadly. A new tremor ran through the aircraft, and at that moment I understood that the hydraulic system was failing. The landing gear could not deploy, which made the landing maneuver almost impossible. I had no choice but to attempt an emergency landing in the mountains, using the few functional controls I had left. My only consolation was that the rain, which had started again, would cover the sound of the falling aircraft. If anyone heard me, maybe they would think it was just the wind. But the flight was becoming more unpredictable. The jerks were constant. The system's readings were more erratic than ever. I could feel the sweat soaking my back as I struggled to maintain control of the aircraft. The pressure in my chest was unbearable. What had once seemed like a simple mechanical failure had become a game of survival. Each passing second was a reminder of how little I could do in the face of the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, the cockpit light flickered, and I saw a red flash on the screen indicating a fuel leak. The main engine was failing, and there wasn't much time left before I was completely out of power. The plane swerved sharply to the left as if something invisible was pushing it into the abyss. My hands gripped the controls tightly and my mind focused on only one thing: survival. Fear could not overpower me. If it did, I would lose everything. I was descending rapidly now. In a last-ditch effort, I stretched the controls and tried to maneuver the plane for as smooth a landing as possible. The thick clouds covering the sky dissipated briefly, revealing a small valley in which I could land, although the margin of error was minimal. The terrain was covered with vegetation, and at first glance it looked like a suitable place for an emergency landing. As I approached the ground, I felt the tension in my arm muscles. Every correction I made was like a deadly dance between life and death. The speed of the descent was alarming, but I still had a small margin to align the plane with the ground. The wheels barely touched the ground when the impact was violent. The plane slid a few feet before coming to a stop, its fuselage clawing at the earth like a wounded beast. My body was paralyzed with shock. Pain began to settle in my shoulder where I had been hit during landing, but I was alive. I could not believe it. Despite the chaos, despite the insanity of the flight, I was on the ground. The sound of the dying engine and the whistling of the wind made me realize that I had survived by pure instinct. The plane was in no condition to take off again. My clothes were soaked, the rain had started again, and it all seemed like a dream from which I could not wake up. But I was alive, and that thought, more than anything else, allowed me to get out of the destroyed aircraft and start walking into the unknown, into the world where I didn't know what awaited me. The storm was about to rage again, and the wind was blowing hard, but for once it didn't matter. I had survived, and that was all that mattered. Rain has always been a constant reminder to me of the fragility of life. The drops hitting the glass, the rhythmic, heavy sound take me back to that time in my childhood, when everything seemed unreal, when my twin brother disappeared. Years have passed since then, but his absence remains an open wound that never closes. And yet, when the storm begins to rage as it is now, I can't help but think that the answers were always closer than I imagined. My name is Hugo Salazar, a suspense writer. I make my living creating dark plots and unexpected twists. But the truth is that I have always been the protagonist of a story even more twisted than any tale I have ever written. A writer must know despair, emptiness, unsolved mysteries, and I know them well. My brother Rodrigo disappeared one rainy night when we were kids. We were 8 years old. The rain was intense, almost blinding, but my mother insisted that we go out to play with our bikes in the garden. Then he was just gone. He disappeared. He left no trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints that could have been traced, just emptiness. The case was never solved. The police found nothing, and eventually, my mother stopped mentioning his name. My father, for his part, did nothing but drown himself in his work, and the echo of her disappearance became a taboo topic of conversation in the house. Life went on, but something in me never stopped searching for answers. As a writer, it haunted me. Rodrigo's disappearance became the recurring theme of my life, the shadow that never dissipated. It's been almost 2 decades since he disappeared, and I still live with that question. What really happened to my brother? Why was he never heard from again? I have tried to live a normal life, but the need to understand the truth has always been there, again and again, drowning my thoughts and my words. Recently, I moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. The place is dark, with low ceilings and thick walls that barely let in any sunlight. I've always been drawn to the darkness, the stillness, and of course the rain. Just the kind of place that allows me to write without distractions. The house is isolated, which allows me to concentrate on my novels without the constant pressure of people. But in the last few days, something strange has started to happen. It all started when I found an old box in the attic of the house. It was covered in dust and seemed to have been forgotten for years. When I opened it, I found a series of yellowed papers and old photos. But what caught my attention most was an envelope with no return address or return address. It was sealed, and inside was a letter written in red ink. I can't say what prompted me to open it, but I did, and what I read took my breath away. The letter was brief, but each word washed over me like a cold wave. It read as follows: "Your brother did not leave. He was taken. They knew, and now they are watching you. If you keep looking, they will find you." A strange sensation ran down my spine as I read those words. The letter was signed with a single letter: R. I didn't know who he was or why he was sending me this message, but somehow the content seemed familiar. My brother had been no ordinary child. Since we were little, we both shared a connection that I couldn't describe. I always felt that Rodrigo could read my thoughts. When he disappeared, a part of me always believed he had left something behind, something I could never discover. And now this letter seemed to be a sign. From that moment on, I began to notice strange things. One morning, as I was walking down the street to the local bookstore, I saw a man standing on the corner. He didn't see me, but I felt his gaze fixed on me, a sense of discomfort that chilled me to the bone. I turned around to make sure it wasn't someone I knew, but the man had already disappeared into the crowd. At that moment, something inside me told me that this man had something to do with my brother's disappearance, although I couldn't explain it. In the following days, the feeling of being watched intensified. In every corner of the house, in every street I walked down, I felt that something was stalking me, an invisible but unmistakable presence. Every time I passed the bookstore, the same man seemed to be there, watching me from the shadows. I could no longer ignore him. I decided to follow him, but I never managed to get close enough to confront him. He always disappeared before I could reach him. One night, as I was going through the papers and photos I had found in the box, something in one of the photographs caught my attention. It was a picture of Rodrigo, taken in the garden of our old house. He was smiling, but what surprised me was what was behind him. In the distance, barely visible among the trees, there was a dark, almost ethereal figure that seemed to be watching him. I couldn't recognize it, but that figure seemed unsettling. Was it just my imagination, or was there really someone else in that picture? What did that mean? Was that the figure watching me? The letter, the shadows, the photos, everything seemed to be connected somehow. I decided to investigate further, beyond the distorted memories of my childhood. As the days went by, I began to gather information about missing persons in the area. I found other cases that were never solved, people who, like Rodrigo, had disappeared without a trace. The most disconcerting thing was that all the missing people seemed to have something in common. They had been children who disappeared in circumstances similar to those of my brother. Something sinister was brewing in my mind. What if my brother was never gone? What if someone had taken him? What if that same someone was behind other disappearances? One night, without warning, the man appeared at my door. I had imagined it so many times, but seeing him in person made me feel a strange mix of fear and determination. He didn't say anything to me. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel that he knew what I was looking for. Then he told me without saying a single word. It was such a heavy silence that it filled me with terror. The next day, I decided to go to the old house where I had lived with my family. The rain had begun to fall again, dark and persistent. The house was empty, uninhabited, just as I remembered it. The air was thick, as if something had been trapped in those walls. When I entered, a musty smell filled my lungs. Dim, dingy light filtered through the broken windows. But what caught my attention was the basement. I had never had the courage to go down there before. But this time, the feeling that I had to pushed me down. What I found there changed my life forever. On the basement floor, covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs, was an object. I bent down and took it in my hands. It was an old diary with a worn leather cover. Opening it, I found a series of entries written in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. As I read, my heart began to beat faster. It was my mother's diary, and in its pages I discovered something I had never imagined. My brother had not disappeared by accident. He had been chosen, taken by a secret group that operated in the shadows. They not only kidnapped children, but used them in their experiments, tests that no one was supposed to know about. My brother had been part of those experiments. The organization had recruited him for reasons my mother never understood, but which at the time seemed all too clear to me. In the end, my mother had decided to run away. She decided to erase all traces, to change our lives, but she could never fully remove us from the web of shadows in which we were trapped. Those who were watching us never stopped looking. Now, after so long, it all made sense. The man watching me was part of them, and I had been unconsciously searching for answers to a mystery that had never really gone away. Finally, the truth had come out. The web of conspiracies that had haunted me for years had been exposed. Those who controlled the disappearances, those who manipulated our lives, were dismantled. My brother, though lost in time, had been part of something much bigger, something the world was now beginning to know. But the truth, though liberating, never brought peace. My name is Edward Turner, and I have been working as an art historian for years. I have specialized in the analysis of Renaissance paintings, which have been my passion since I was a young student. Throughout my career, I have had the privilege of studying some of the most famous works of art in history. But never before has anything so captured my attention as the series of unknown paintings that I began researching a few months ago. It all started when I came across an old folder in the archives of the museum where I work. It was a collection of dusty, vaguely labeled documents. At first I thought it was a series of forgotten research on minor artists, but when I started flipping through it, I discovered something much more intriguing. In the first few pages, there was a series of paintings by an unknown artist. Each one appeared to be a masterpiece, but with something strange about its composition. Most of the pieces were dated from the 18th century, but there was no known record of their author. At first I didn't think much of it. However, something disturbed me. Each painting seemed to have a common pattern. There were subtle symbols and details, barely noticeable to the naked eye, that were repeated in all the works. Also, something about the backgrounds of the paintings did not fit the styles of the time. It was as if the painter was conveying a hidden message through his canvases. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much bigger behind these works. I decided to investigate further. Every time I looked at the paintings, something new emerged. In one of them, a seascape, I noticed that a small island in the background seemed to have a strange shape, as if it represented a map. In another, a banquet scene, the arrangement of dishes and utensils seemed to follow a precise mathematical pattern. In a portrait of a woman, the details in her eyes seemed to indicate a path, as if she were guiding someone toward something. My mind began to work in a direction I had never considered before. Could it be that this unknown painter had left clues in his works? Clues to something larger? Something lost? As my research progressed, I dove deeper into the details of each painting. I spent weeks poring over the works, analyzing every brushstroke, every shadow, every figure. The patterns were unmistakable. And then I found something that chilled my blood. In one of the most famous paintings in the series, a portrait of a man in a red cloak, I saw an inscription hidden in the canvas just in the lower left corner. It was written in an ancient language, something I recognized as a mixture of Latin and Greek. When I managed to translate it, what I found took my breath away. The key is under the stone that has never been moved. Immediately, my mind overflowed with questions. What did it mean? Was there a specific place it referred to? And why had the painter left this message on such an important work? Even though my instinct told me I was looking at something monumental, I knew I had to stay calm and not get carried away. I decided to continue my research, becoming more and more obsessed with what I had found. My first action was to return to the museum and study the other works in the same series. Each painting seemed to have a direct reference to a specific location or object, albeit in an enigmatic way. One landscape showed a mountain with a cave hidden behind a giant oak tree. Another scene depicted a ship at sea, but the angle at which it was set caused a series of islands to line up in a precise manner, forming a triangle of sorts. Each painting was full of details like this, but none of them were clear enough to be a map or a straightforward guide. Everything was shrouded in mystery. My research took me to various museums and archives in Europe, searching for any reference to the painter and his works. However, everything seemed to be carefully erased. There were no records of exhibitions, sales, or mentions of this artist. Most disconcerting was that in some cases, the paintings had been removed from the collections without explanation. As I delved deeper into the mystery, I began to feel watched. Sometimes, arriving at a museum or a library. I could notice someone following me, but I could find no evidence of it. Maybe it was paranoia, but something told me that I was not alone in this investigation. Finally, after months of work, I managed to decipher what seemed to be the key to finding the treasure. A series of paintings showed the face of a woman who, although the same in each painting, changed slightly in posture or expression. In one of the last paintings in the series, she was seen standing next to a tree on the edge of a cliff. Looking closely, I could see an almost invisible inscription on her necklace, which read, "Look for the full moon when the last flower falls." My head was spinning with this new clue. Not only was it a cryptic message, but a series of coordinates that seemed to be related to astronomical events. I decided to travel to the location that seemed most likely, a small island in the Mediterranean, which had appeared in several of the paintings. In each painting, the island was depicted differently, but they all seemed to align with a single landmark, a lighthouse marking the end of a cliff, accessible only at low tide. When I arrived, the atmosphere was oppressive. The wind was blowing hard, and dark clouds covered the sky, as if the weather was trying to warn me of something. The lighthouse was abandoned, overgrown with weeds, but I could see that its structure was much older than it looked. I decided to look for the stone mentioned in the inscription on the painting, which had never been moved. After several hours of searching, I found a large rock next to the base of the lighthouse. It was heavier than I thought, but when I managed to move it, something strange happened. Underneath it, an old wooden box appeared, carefully sealed. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside, I found a series of rolled-up scrolls, each marked with symbols I recognized from the paintings. There was also a small gold medal, which appeared to be a symbol of ancient nobility. The scrolls contained more details about the lost treasure, as well as about the painter who had created the series. His name, which had never been known, turned out to be a man who had lived in the 17th century and who had hidden a vast treasure of art and wealth, seeking to preserve his legacy for those clever enough to discover it. But upon opening the box, I also discovered something far more disturbing, a series of letters describing how those who tried to follow the treasure trail would be pursued by a network of people willing to do anything to keep it hidden. There was something sinister about this find, and I couldn't help but wonder if my own life was now in danger. Why had this unknown painter chosen me? Was this a story that should be left in the dark? That day, on the island, I understood that the treasure did not only consist of material riches. There was something far more valuable, knowledge and the power to unlock secrets that had been kept hidden for centuries. However, I also understood that, the moment I had discovered it, I had become part of a dangerous game, one that I would probably not be able to walk away from without consequences. But in spite of everything, the truth had already come out. I woke up with an excruciating headache. At first, everything was blurry and confusing. My eyes squinted from the dim light filtering in from some dark corner. I tried to move, but something prevented me. My body was rigid, as if I had been tied to the bed, but I couldn't remember how or why. I forced my eyes fully open, and reality slowly materialized. I was not in my home, not in a hotel, not in any familiar place. My surroundings were disturbing. Dirty gray walls with cracks that let chunks of plaster leak out. The air was thick with moisture, and the musty smell was unbearable. This was not a modern hospital, nor one that had been in operation recently. This was an abandoned hospital, but I still had a strange feeling of being alive, as if someone or something was watching every move I made. As I tried to move again, I realized that my wrists were bound to the corners of the bed with thick straps. My heart began to race. I swallowed saliva, trying to comprehend what was happening. I remembered blurry fragments of my life, my job, my daily routine, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. My mind was foggy, as if I was trapped in a thick fog that prevented me from thinking clearly. I started to struggle against the straps, but I was too weak. I felt exhausted, as if I had been sleeping for days, maybe weeks. Sweat began to bead on my forehead as I tried to comprehend my situation. I couldn't. I didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me. There was something very wrong here. This place wasn't just an empty hospital abandoned by the passage of time. There was something more sinister inside. I looked around, trying to find something that would give me answers. There were no windows, only closed doors that seemed to lead to dark corridors. The ceiling, mostly covered by wires and old ventilation systems, seemed about to collapse. But most disturbing was the sound. There were no sounds of life. just the monotonous hum of the fluorescent lights which remained on despite what must have been total abandonment. Panic began to take hold of me. I tried to scream, but my voice came out weak and raspy. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious, but the uneasiness grew in my chest with every second. My breathing became agitated. Then, like a distant echo, I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the footsteps were real and approaching. I looked toward the door, my pulse racing. From the threshold, a figure slowly appeared, hooded, her face hidden in shadows. My instinct told me it was a person, but something about his posture and the fact that he made no sound as he walked made me doubt. I couldn't see clearly, but his movements seemed studied, calculated, as if he was used to moving in the dark. An unpleasant sensation ran down my spine. The figure stopped just at the edge of the bed. He was so close I could feel his presence, almost tangible. It said nothing, simply watched me for a few seconds, what seemed like an eternity. I felt a shiver run through my body. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The figure raised a hand which held a small syringe with a dark liquid. The feeling of terror grew even more when I noticed that I was not alone in this place. There were more. The man did not come any closer, but somehow, his presence was even more oppressive. With an almost imperceptible gesture, he made the straps on my wrists loosen. I didn't say a word. All I could do was follow his movements with my eyes. The eyes, hidden in shadow, seemed to be able to pierce me, to read my thoughts, to know my deepest fears. The needle in his hand seemed to glow with a light of its own. My mind was clouded, but I knew what was coming. I knew what I had to do. Deep down, deep inside me, I understood that I was not in just any hospital. This place, these beings, were not what they seemed. I was being watched, manipulated, used as a subject for something much darker. Something much bigger than my mind had been able to conceive. My body trembled involuntarily as the man advanced, injecting the liquid into my arm with chilling precision. I felt no immediate pain, only a sensation of extreme cold that spread throughout my body, the sensation of something unknown taking control of my system. My vision began to blur even more, and everything became blurrier, more confusing. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the same room. The bed was gone, and I was in a small windowless room. The walls were metal, cold, and polished. Somehow I knew that this place was beyond any hospital or institution. It was something much bigger, much more sinister. My mind began to work at full speed. These scientists, these doctors, were not interested in healing. They were not interested in my well-being. They had turned me into an experiment, and everything that had been happening was part of a series of tests, of cruel manipulations to see how far a human being could go before breaking. There was something else behind it all, something I still didn't fully understand. As my thoughts became clearer, I realized something even more terrifying. These scientists were not alone. There were others like me, trapped in this place, being watched, being used. Distant murmurs and screams confirmed to me what I had begun to suspect. I was not alone. There were more of us, and not all of us would survive. The place was filled with cameras. It was not a hospital, it was a clandestine experimentation center. These doctors had no concern for the health or well-being of their patients. They were simply test subjects, pieces of a macabre puzzle that was being constructed with each new experiment. It was days, perhaps weeks, before I could find a way out. The doses of that liquid I had been injected with began to affect my mind, leaving me weaker with each passing day. The testing sessions were exhausting. I was forced to undergo all kinds of examinations, physical and psychological manipulations. Every time I thought I had discovered something, another door closed. But a part of me never stopped fighting, never stopped looking for a way out. One day, after what seemed like endless trials, I found the opportunity. The scientists, so confident in their control, made a mistake. The door to my cell was left open for a brief moment. I saw it, and I didn't hesitate for a second. I ran as fast as I could through the dark, empty corridors. The screams of the other test subjects echoed off the walls, but I refused to look back. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. Adrenaline was driving me, my body was exhausted, but my mind was more alert than ever. Finally, I managed to reach the exit. The front door was unguarded, perhaps because they were confident that no one could escape. However, the fear I had felt in those dark corridors drove me to make the last effort. When I reached the door, I was met with a terrifying surprise. It was sealed, locked from the outside. It had been a sacrifice. It had all been a trap. A sense of defeat came over me, and everything fell apart. I was trapped, but the truth is that I refused to give up. If there was one thing I had learned in that place, it was that nothing could be trusted, or anyone. My name is Marcos Duval, and I had always been a man of logic. What I didn't understand, I discarded, and what seemed unreal, I labeled as superstition or mere fantasy. Perhaps for that reason, I had never taken much interest in my family's mansion. In fact, for the past few years, I had avoided even thinking about it. However, when I received the news of the death of my uncle Agustin, the last family member still residing in the mansion, circumstances changed drastically. The lawyer told me about a will and, to my surprise, mentioned that the property had been left to me. Without much hesitation, I made the decision to take it over. After all, money had never been my main motivation, but the idea of owning something so imposing, so full of history and mystery, awakened a latent curiosity that I had never recognized in myself. The Duval mansion was located in a secluded plot of land, surrounded by large trees and a thick fog that seemed to envelop it even during the day. From the moment I arrived, the feeling of abandonment hit me hard. The stone walls, which had once been a testament to opulence, were now weathered by the passage of time. The windows were covered in a thick dust, as if no one had touched anything in years. There was something in the air, something unsettling that made me slightly uncomfortable, but I couldn't identify it. I spent the first day exploring. The mansion was huge, with long corridors that seemed to get lost in the darkness. Each room had a story, or so I felt. Some were covered by sheets that hid the furniture, while others were completely inaccessible, blocked by bookshelves full of old, smelly books. It was not my intention to stay there for long, but something in the atmosphere of the mansion kept me trapped. The place was filled with antiques, paintings depicting past generations of the Duvals, and a strange feeling that the family had left the mansion for reasons I had never asked about. However, it wasn't until the third day that I found something that would change my life forever. While perusing an old library in search of any books that might help me understand my family's history, I stumbled upon a section that seemed to have been ignored for decades. The books there were covered with cobwebs, and the layer of dust was so thick it made me cough. Among them, one in particular caught my eye. Not because of the title, which was in a language I didn't recognize, but because of the fact that it was placed in a strange way, slightly tilted on the shelf as if someone had tried to hide it. As I touched it, I noticed that the wood of the shelf creaked, and to my surprise, a part of the wall behind the books moved. I felt a shiver run through my body, and an indescribable feeling of unease came over me. The wall had given way, revealing a secret door. The door was small and had no handle, but once pushed hard enough, it slid open slowly, with an unpleasant creaking sound. On the other side, there was a spiraling staircase descending into darkness. I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me from that darkness, but even so, my curiosity overcame my fear. I decided to go down. The staircase led me to a hidden room, cold and damp, with exposed stone walls. In the center of the room was a large table, made of old wood covered with stains that I could not immediately identify. The whole air was permeated with a metallic smell, as if something had been spilled there long ago and never cleaned up. Around the table were strange symbols engraved on the floor, as if someone had performed a ritual in that very spot. On the walls I saw more symbols, some similar to the ones I had seen in the book I had found in the library, but others were completely new to me. I didn't care how hard I tried to rationalize what I saw. Something didn't fit. It didn't fit the image I had of my family, nor the way I had been raised. The Duvals had always been known for their distinction, for their education, for their supposed morality. No one, not even in my worst nightmares, would have imagined that something like this was linked to them. Along the walls, I noticed several photographs of people I didn't recognize, some even showing what appeared to be strange rituals like sacrifices or invocations. I thought I might be viewing it all through the filter of superstition, but noticing a date on the edge of one of the photographs, my heart stopped. The date coincided with the period when my great-great-grandfather, René Duval, had been considered a prominent figure in the family. However, his story had been shrouded in mystery, and no one had spoken much about him. Rumors about his activities, about his obsession with ancient religions and cults, had always been whispers from older people. Rumors that my family would never confirm. As my eyes roamed the room, I began to see more disturbing details. In one corner there was a metal box, locked. On an impulse, I opened it, and inside I found a series of old documents, jumbled, with names and dates I didn't understand. However, something stood out among the papers. A black leather diary, worn by time, with the initials RD engraved on the cover. Without further thought, I took the journal and began to read. Each page seemed darker than the last, describing in detail the rituals performed in that very room. Rituals that promised to achieve power and immortality through cruel and macabre methods. In the last pages, the story became even more disturbing, mentioning human sacrifices and dark pacts. At first I thought it was a joke or perhaps a work of macabre fiction written by someone with a sick mind. But the presence of my great-great-grandfather in the text, his dedication to such rituals, and the references to Duval family names made it clear to me that what I was reading was not a figment of my imagination. Terrified, I stuffed the journal in my coat and tried to flee the scene, but something inside me told me that I should no longer ignore what I had discovered. As I climbed back up the stairs, I felt that the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around me, that the place was no longer mine. Everything I had known about my family, about my ancestors, seemed to crumble. There was something rotten at the core of it all, something that went back generations. In the days that followed, I researched further about René Duval and his connection to rituals. I discovered that, in his time, he had been known for his overweening ambition, and many believed that his quest for power had led him to resort to dark means. The family had tried to erase all traces of his practices, but the evidence was still there, in the mansion, in those documents, and on the walls of the secret room. Finally, I made a decision. I could not let that dark legacy go unexposed. I knew that the mansion would never be a home for me again, but I also knew that the truth had to be revealed. My family's dark secrets, which had been buried for so long, finally came to light. And with them, the Duval mansion was forever scarred by the horrors of its past. The mansion was finally sold, and the new owners decided to demolish it. When the workmen arrived, they found the secret room, but I could no longer return to see what was left of it. I made sure the documents were turned over to the authorities, but even now, remembering everything, I feel a deep uneasiness. Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain buried, but mine was too big to remain hidden. The rain was coming down hard that night, as if the whole sky had been dumped on the forest. Darkness seeped through the trees, casting everything in its path in a blanket of impenetrable shadows. My name is Daniel, and I am an experienced hunter. I spent years chasing deer, bear, and even wild boar in these woods, knowing every nook and cranny, every secret corner of the land. But that night, something changed. Something I could not foresee. Something that, had I known, would never have happened. I began my hunt at dusk. The weather didn't worry me. Rain had always accompanied me on my quieter days in the woods. I had grown accustomed to the humidity, the mud on my boots, the sound of water soaking the leaves and branches. But that night, the wind was different. It wasn't just a passing gust, but a constant wind, a buzzing in my ears as if the forest itself was whispering something against me. It was a couple of hours before I noticed that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the rain, nor the dense darkness that seemed to engulf every corner of the forest, but a strange feeling. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or the natural tension that comes with hunting, but I soon realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt that someone, or something, was watching me. I kept walking, keeping my senses alert, but the feeling of being followed persisted, growing with each step. My first thought was that I might have run into another hunter. Perhaps someone else had decided to go out that night in search of prey, and the forest being so vast, it would not be unusual for our paths to cross. But the rain and wind made any attempt to hear sounds other than my own difficult. Gradually, I realized that I could hear nothing but the pattering of the rain against the leaves, the crunching of branches beneath my feet, and the distant sound of thunder. There was no sign of human presence. However, something told me that I was not alone. In an effort to calm my nerves, I decided to stop and rest for a moment. I crouched behind a fallen log, shielded my rifle under the layer of rain, and closed my eyes for a second, seeking to regain control. The feeling of being watched intensified, like a pressure on my chest, an invisible weight that I could not shake. When I opened my eyes again, a shiver ran down my spine. In the background, beyond the trees, I thought I saw a figure moving through the fog. It wasn't an animal, that much was clear. It was a human silhouette, vaguely outlined, gliding with a speed and precision that could not have been accidental. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things due to fatigue or if there really was someone there. My heart began to beat faster, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Without a second thought, I decided to move quickly, away from the figure. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the roar of the storm, but the figure was still there, always one step behind me. At first, I tried to calm myself, repeating to myself that I must be imagining things, but the chill on my skin, the quickening of my pulse, and the echo of every rustle in the distance told me otherwise. It was following me. I knew it was following me. Desperation began to take hold of me, and for the first time in many years, I felt real fear. It wasn't the fear you feel when faced with a wild beast. It wasn't the uncertainty that accompanies the hunt. This fear was different, a deep, visceral fear. I was becoming paranoid, but as I advanced through the thick forest, the feeling of being stalked only intensified. I changed direction, disoriented by the rain and darkness, hoping to lose my pursuer, but he always seemed to be one step behind, as if he could read my movements, anticipate them before I took them. Every time I looked back, the silhouette was a little closer, moving fluidly and silently through the trees, as if the forest were his home, as if he were part of the very darkness that surrounded him. He couldn't be a hunter, I thought. No man could move with such dexterity under these conditions. He couldn't be someone else from the forest. The way he moved was eerie, almost supernatural in its fluidity. But then, who was it? And why was it following me? In desperation, I sought shelter in what appeared to be a small cave, an opening in a rock where the rain could not reach me. I stayed there, breathing heavily, trying to think, trying to find a solution. But the sound of the storm, the constant pounding of the raindrops, was driving me crazy. In that instant, I understood something terrifying: the silence. For a brief second, the wind ceased, the rain calmed, and I could clearly hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, as if the figure had stopped hiding. There was no escape. I was trapped. There was no choice but to go out and face it, though I knew I was unprepared. I stepped out of the cave, my rifle in my hands, my body tense as a spring, and began to walk in the opposite direction, hoping to gain some distance. But the figure, ever lurking, never stopped following me. No matter how fast I walked, no matter what routes I took, it was always there, like a lingering shadow. My feet sank into the mud, my strength drained, and the mental exhaustion became more unbearable. I began to stumble, but still I dared not look back. I was aware that, if I did, I was going to see something that would be hard to forget, something I had never thought I would see in my life. Suddenly, the figure stopped moving. I didn't know if I had lost the trail, or if he had decided the game was over, but that moment of stillness was more terrifying than any sound. He was too close. My mind, already on the verge of collapse, began to imagine worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last. I decided I couldn't go on like this anymore. Without thinking, I moved deeper into the thickest forest, hoping the darkness would swallow me up, hoping to be lost forever if it would keep me safe. But the stalking continued. Like a stalking animal, I knew I could not escape. Morning came with the light of a weak sun. The storm had ceased, but the traces of fear remained. No one was behind me. No one had followed me. But something changed in me that night. Something snapped. I knew I had been in danger, but I also knew that the figure would never stop stalking me, that the forest was its home as much as it had been mine. The threat had never gone away, and it never would. I got lost that night, and somehow, I never came back. I always knew that the job of construction worker wasn't for everyone. The long days, the sweat, the fatigue, the constant risk of something going wrong. But I had always enjoyed it. The mornings, the sound of tools hitting metal, the creaking of timbers, the constant coming and going of trucks, the orders flying through the air. To me, that hustle and bustle was synonymous with life. It had always been that way. But everything changed when it started to rain. The storm came without warning, as if the sky had been waiting for the right moment to unleash its fury. It had been a day like any other. Work, sweat, a few short breaks, the usual complaints. The construction site was crowded, as usual, and all I could think about was getting home, leaving my wet uniform in the locker room and taking a hot shower. Nothing to make me think that my life was about to take an irreversible turn. That's when I heard it for the first time. As I was pushing a wheelbarrow full of debris, my phone vibrated in my pocket. At first I thought it was a text message or something trivial, but when I looked at the screen, I saw it was a call, an unknown number. I don't usually answer calls from unknown numbers, but something prompted me to pick up. It was a whisper, at first barely audible, as if the person on the other end of the line was waiting for me to come closer to speak more clearly. "I'm watching you," the voice said. I froze. The dolly fell to the floor, but the voice was still speaking. There was nothing else in the call, just those words, repeated several times. Then silence. Almost a sigh. Then the phone went dead. I thought it might be a joke, a friend doing one of his stupid things. But fear began to build up in my chest, and an uncomfortable feeling made me look around. No one seemed to be paying attention to me. Everyone was going about their business as usual. I let it go, at least at first. I figured someone had probably messed with the number. Maybe a random number or a practical joke. I didn't think much of it. But later that afternoon, while loading heavy materials on the third floor, I felt it again. That same impulse. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and as I looked at the screen, I saw that it was again an unknown number. My heart was pounding, and although I hesitated for a moment, I decided to answer it. I was not prepared for what I heard. "The gaze is on you. Now you're walking on my turf." I almost threw the phone to the floor. My hands began to shake. I looked around, looking for someone who might be joking, but I didn't see anyone who might have said those words. The worst part was not the voice, but what I felt next. The air seemed heavier, and the daylight, which had seemed warm and comforting before, became cold, uncomfortable. Someone was watching me, and I knew it. The rest of the day passed slowly, with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. My coworkers didn't seem to notice anything strange, but I couldn't stop looking around. I felt like an animal being chased by an invisible predator. The feeling that someone was there, following me, watching my every move, never left me. That night, when I got home, I tried to relax. I put on some music, took a shower, ate something. But still, something kept hammering away in my head. Something wasn't right. Who was this person? Why was he watching me? For several hours I tried not to think about it, but the call wouldn't leave me alone. I decided to check the number. Without thinking too much, I Googled the prefix of the unknown number, but found nothing. There was no reference, no clue that could help me. That night I went to bed feeling heavy in my chest, and although I was exhausted, sleep did not come easily. The next day, rain fell again on the construction site. The sky was gray, and the drops hit the ground with an almost military force, as if the weather itself was against me. But what really disturbed me was not the storm, but what awaited me. The morning began as usual. Workers came and went, trucks unloaded materials, and machinery roared as it served its purpose. But that morning, something had changed. Something I couldn't immediately identify. I felt an uneasiness in the air, as if everything was more tense than usual. As I worked, I began to feel the same sensation of being watched. At first I thought it was my paranoia, but I couldn't ignore it. I would look up and, for an instant, I thought I saw figures in the shadows, among the piles of rubble and unfinished structures. But when I looked more closely, I saw nothing. I convinced myself that I was imagining things, but the feeling was still there. Then my phone vibrated again, the unknown number once again. My stomach sank. The voice on the other end of the line was not the same. This time it was deeper, more ominous. "Time's running out, buddy. Are you ready for what's coming?" The voice was closer this time, as if speaking to me from inside the same construction site. I looked around, trying to find some clue, but nothing. Nothing that would help me understand what was happening. The atmosphere at the construction site had changed completely. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, and the shadows of the unfinished structure seemed to lengthen like fingers stalking me. That afternoon, I decided to make a decision. I needed to know who was behind those calls and why they were watching me. But before I could do anything, my coworker, Victor, approached me and handed me a package without saying a word. It was wrapped in black plastic, as if trying to hide something inside. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a photo. A picture of me, taken at the same construction site, but taken from an angle I hadn't seen before. In the picture I was working, but in the background, in the shadows of a half-constructed building, I could make out a figure with a human silhouette watching me. I couldn't see the details clearly, but I was sure that figure wasn't there when I took the picture. It was a disturbing image. It had been taken by someone who was watching me at that very moment. I froze. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo. I felt my head spinning. I felt short of breath. At that moment, I understood that it was not a joke, nor a coincidence. Someone knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and worst of all, someone was watching my every move, with the intention of intimidating me, of making me feel vulnerable. I left the package on the table and walked outside, searching for answers on the dark horizon, in the shadows that lengthened with every step. The rain continued to fall, but this time I didn't care. The cold no longer affected me. My mind could only think of one thing. Find that person. Find out who was behind all this, and most importantly, stop him before it was too late. As the storm raged above me, a new call came in. "Have you realized what's going on, Daniel? It's just the beginning." My body tensed at the sound of my name. Something inside me knew this was no longer a game. Something was afoot. Something much bigger than me. Time was running out, and I was at the center of something much darker than I had ever imagined. I will begin my story with a simple but disturbing fact. There are things you don't expect to encounter while working. I learned this the hard way during a project that changed my life. My name is Samuel Hernandez, and I am an architect. My specialty is the restoration of old buildings. There is something about working with history in bringing walls, ceilings, and stones back to life that makes me feel like I am part of something bigger than myself. But I never imagined that restoration, a seemingly routine project, would be the one that would throw me into the abyss of humanity's darkest secrets. The project in question was the restoration of a historic building, a former prison located on the outskirts of the city. It had been abandoned for decades, but the authorities decided to rehabilitate it into a cultural center. My job was to make sure the structure was safe, restore the facades damaged by the passage of time, and preserve the historical essence of the place. At first, everything seemed simple, but I soon realized that there was more to the prison than met the eye. The first time I entered the building, I was overcome by a feeling of heaviness. It was as if the air was thicker than in other places, and the walls, although they used to be imposing, seemed to hold something from their past, something that did not want to be discovered. But I just ignored those sensations. After all, what I had in front of me was a work that needed my expert hands, and the weight of history was not going to intimidate me. The first few weeks were uneventful. My team and I began working on the visible areas of the prison, the main corridors, the cells, and the outer courtyard. The cracked walls, the broken windows, the dust covering every nook and cranny. It was evident that it had been uninhabited for a long time. The building, although majestic in its time, showed signs of decay. However, in the back of my mind, a persistent echo whispered to me that something was not right. One afternoon, while examining the original plans for the building, something caught my eye. There was a part of the basement that was not on the plans. It was unusual to find something like that in such an old building, and I decided to investigate further. No one on the team knew anything about it, which made me even more curious. In the town hall archives, I found a cryptic note that mentioned a hidden basement, but it didn't specify what it had been used for. I decided then to go down to that area of the building, armed with a flashlight and my tools. The basement was dark, darker than I imagined. The humidity in the air mixed with the dust accumulated in the corners, creating a thick, sticky atmosphere. I walked through the narrow corridors, where the echo of my footsteps echoed off the stone walls. The flashlight illuminated only what was in front of me, and the feeling of claustrophobia increased with every step. It was an oppressive place, not only because of its structure, but also because of the heavy air emanating from the walls. There was something here that didn't fit. Finally, I found a small door, hidden behind a broken brick wall. It was locked, but a rusty hinge allowed it to open easily. As I pushed the door open, a wave of cold air hit my face, as if the cellar had been sealed for centuries. Inside, the darkness was total, but the flashlight slowly illuminated the space. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a stale, ancient air, but with an unbearable peculiarity, a metallic smell that at first I didn't understand. Then, as my gaze roamed around the place, I understood. The basement was full of tools, but they were no ordinary tools. They were instruments of torture. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. I was so used to history, to ancient objects, that I thought I had entered a horror movie set, that my mind was playing tricks. But on closer inspection, I realized the truth. They were real tools. Iron cranes for immobilizing people, torture chairs, weights and shackles. All of it was covered in dust and rust, but the shape of each piece was unmistakable. They were instruments designed to cause pain, suffering, and humiliation. I couldn't understand what all that was doing in the basement of a prison. The historical records of the place mentioned nothing about torture. On the contrary, they spoke of a prison system that, despite its harsh conditions, was based on strict discipline, but without physical cruelty. Why had these objects been hidden? What secrets did the place hold? My mind began to run through the possible scenarios, but logic seemed to crumble at every step. I decided to take pictures of the tools, hoping that some authority could help me shed light on the mystery. As I did so, my flashlight illuminated a wall that was partially covered by what looked like a gray, almost transparent cloth. As I moved the cloth, I discovered a small inscription etched into the wall. The handwriting, though difficult to read, appeared to be from a century past. The message, though deteriorated, read, "The jailer is still alive." My heart stopped for a moment. A jailer? Who had this person been, and why had he remained anonymous all this time? I decided to investigate further. I took several photos of the inscription, and with a growing sense of discomfort, retreated from the basement to talk to the project administrators. I needed answers, and I couldn't wait any longer. When I told them about what I had found, their reaction was immediate, but also puzzling. At first, they didn't want to take me seriously, but when I showed them the photos of the tools, their faces changed. It was as if they had seen a ghost. One of the people in charge, an older man named Jorge, asked me to accompany him to the office. There, he revealed something I would never have imagined. The building, he explained, had originally been a maximum security prison in the 19th century. But beyond its function as a prison, it had been known in its day as a re-education center for the most dangerous prisoners. The official story spoke of strict but humane methods, yet an unofficial version had leaked out about a sadistic jailer who took it upon himself to re-educate prisoners in extreme ways. No one knew much about him, but there were rumors that he was in charge of torturing prisoners with cruel methods, using tools like the ones I had found. The jailer had mysteriously disappeared sometime in the 1880s, but his body was never found. After that revelation, I felt trapped in a maze of horror and bewilderment. The truth was there, hidden in the walls of that prison, and I had unearthed something that even those responsible for the project did not want to face. As time passed, I could not stop thinking about that jailer and the lives that had been destroyed within those walls. The story had been kept secret for a reason, and I had been the one to uncover that truth. The restoration of the building continued, but the atmosphere changed. The workers, upon learning what had happened, became more reserved, and some abandoned the project for fear of what might have happened in those corridors. I couldn't stop thinking about those tools, about the suffering they had caused. The place was no longer just an architectural project, but a reminder of the shadows of the past. Historical records spoke little more of the jailer, but somewhere in that building, in its corridors and cells, his presence remained, a presence that was never forgotten. The rain was hitting the car window furiously, as if the sky itself was trying to stop me, but it was too late to turn back. My name is Javier Ruiz. I am a renowned chef, known as much for my skill in the kitchen as for my meticulous and perfectionist character. What I didn't know that rainy afternoon was that this seemingly harmless invitation would be the one that would change my life forever. The invitation had arrived by email a couple of days earlier. A brief but intriguing message. A select group of people wanted to learn how to cook an exclusive dinner under my supervision. They were telling me about an old, secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was a perfect opportunity to show off my skills, and in addition, a nice break from the usual routine. The conditions were ideal. No distractions, no press pressure or criticism, just the kitchen. My assistant Marta had made the necessary checks. Everything seemed in order, and although there was something strange about the lack of details about the organization or the hosts, I decided to accept. A good challenge never hurts. The car moved along a winding, mud-covered road, and the mansion finally appeared on the horizon. In the middle of the storm, the building looked like a dark shadow, surrounded by a sea of trees that shook violently under the wind. An isolated place, secluded from everything. I could feel the pressure of tension in the air, as if nature itself was warning me. As I arrived, the iron gate opened slowly, as if awaiting my arrival. Inside, the mansion was impressive, though not in the conventional way. The dark wood-paneled walls, the long, narrow hallways, and the scent of wet earth seeping through every crevice. Everything was in its place, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of the house, something that didn't quite fit. Somehow that mansion seemed to me a reflection of the past, as if time had failed to move on completely. A butler dressed in a dark suit greeted me at the door. His face was serious, but I couldn't help noticing a slight look of approval when he saw me enter. We didn't exchange words. He just led me into what looked like a huge kitchen, equipped with everything I needed, although it wasn't modern like the ones in the big restaurants I worked in. It was more like an old-fashioned kitchen, with iron and wooden utensils, and a huge burning fireplace that cast a warm light on the stone surfaces. On a work table were the ingredients he had requested: fruits, vegetables, poultry, spices, and oils, all neatly arranged. But something was not right. A feeling of discomfort came over me when I saw those carefully selected ingredients. Something about the meat didn't seem right. The color, the texture, everything seemed slightly off, but I decided to ignore it, convinced that it was just my paranoia playing on my nerves. After all, everything was laid out perfectly. Soon a group of people appeared in the kitchen. They were a few, no more than 10, all dressed elegantly, almost as if it were a private party, but their behavior was unusual. They stood in silence, watching with an uncomfortable intensity, barely interacting with each other. Some even seemed to be waiting for something. I looked at them closely, but failed to decipher anything. People at these kinds of events are usually polite and aloof, but these were not like the others. There was something else about them, something unspoken that hung in the air, something that kept me on my toes. I began the class, and as the dishes took shape, I realized that my discomfort was not unfounded. There was something about the ingredients that didn't add up, something that made me wonder. The meat was cooking strangely, even the vegetables seemed to be decomposing at an abnormal rate. When I cut an onion, it seemed to have a slimy texture inside, and at the same time the air became thicker. But the worst came when I tried to cut poultry meat. When I pressed on it, the blade slipped as if I were cutting through a foreign material, not meat. My heart pounded, but I decided to keep going. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of the day, Or maybe the fact that I was so far from the city. A rustle of rain pattered on the roof, accompanying the growing tension in the atmosphere. As the class progressed, the strange atmosphere intensified. The diners watched more intently, without a word, without a gesture of approval or criticism. They just followed me with their eyes, a fixed, penetrating gaze that made me even more nervous. Every move I made seemed to be being analyzed, not for their culinary skill, but as if they were being watched in a deeper way, as if they were waiting for something I could not understand. My uneasiness increased with every minute I spent in that mansion. Then, seeing that the meat was not the right color at the end of cooking, I decided to examine it more closely. Something was not right. The meat was not falling apart in the natural way. When I cut into it, I discovered that its interior was filled with a strange, viscous, gray-colored substance, emanating a metallic odor. The feeling of revulsion ran through my whole body. The bird's skin was not that of an animal, but felt synthetic, almost like an artificial material. Panic began to settle in my chest as the others stood silently, watching without saying a word. It was then that one of the guests, an older man with a vacant expression, approached me, but not to congratulate me as I expected. No. Instead, his face showed a slight smile, an empty smile, and he murmured something that I couldn't understand, but that chilled my blood. It was so subtle, so low that I barely heard it, but I felt its meaning deeply. As I looked at them all, I suddenly understood that this was not just a simple culinary event. There was something macabre behind it all. The ingredients were not what they seemed. The people were not there to learn how to cook, and I was caught in a web that I didn't know how it had been woven. My mind started going a mile a minute, looking for a way out, something, anything to escape. But before I could move, one of the assistants slammed the door shut, causing the sound to reverberate off the kitchen walls. My breathing quickened. Fear gripped me. I tried to leave, but the older man blocked my way, while the others slowly rose from their places, approaching without a word. It was then that I understood that the ingredients were not the only fake thing in that place. They, the guests, were not ordinary people. I was in the middle of a game without rules, where I was the prey, and the main course was myself. The rain was still falling, but it didn't matter anymore. In that instant, the storm outside was nothing compared to the internal storm that raged in my chest. Unable to do anything, I was trapped, as they slowly approached, with that empty smile, hoping that my suffering would turn into their gain. The rain pounded the windshield of my car hard, making the sound become a constant drone that seemed to accompany me every kilometer to the factory. Since the plant had gone bankrupt, the atmosphere had changed drastically. The air, thick and heavy with humidity, seemed to press on my chest as I approached the site. My name is Ernesto Silva, operations manager at the Solvex recycling plant, and for the past few months my job had been more a matter of waiting for the inevitable closure to come than looking for solutions. But that morning, when I arrived at the office, something unexpected had happened. An unaddressed envelope with clear instructions. Reopen the C13 section. It was not a simple request. It was a mandate. I didn't know who had sent it or why, but something told me I had to follow it. Section C13 had been closed years ago, long before I took control of the factory. The doors were sealed and the documents about its closure were ambiguous, as if someone wanted to erase all evidence of what had really happened there. No one talked about that part of the plant, and if it was mentioned, it was always in a whisper. The sound of the rain continued to rumble as I parked my car in front of the main entrance. The large iron gate, which was normally closed, was now slightly ajar. Something was not right. A shiver ran down my spine, but my sense of duty compelled me to move forward. Something had to be done, I knew. The factory was on the verge of bankruptcy, and finding something that could save it was a desperate necessity. I headed for the administration area, the place closest to the access to the C13. All was silent, almost unrealistically still. The floor, which had once been a hive of activity, now resembled a mausoleum. The sound of my shoes as I walked on the concrete floor echoed like an echo that never faded. When I arrived at the COO's office, I found the envelope on the desk, as if it were waiting for me. I opened it with trembling hands and read the instructions. I was to make sure that C13 was reopened before the end of the week, and I was to be provided with the code to unlock the doors. Nothing more. No explanation, No clear contact, just a command. It made no sense. However, the fact that I was being led there was no coincidence. Everything was too organized, too planned. I passed through the long, dark corridors, my footsteps echoing off the empty walls. As I approached the entrance to C-13, the air seemed to grow heavier. The door, though ancient, seemed rock solid. I punched the code into the security panel and heard the distinctive click of the door opening. With an anxious sigh, I stepped inside. The interior was gloomy. The lights, barely operational, were flickering. The work equipment was covered in dust, but there was something eerie in the air, as if the place had never really been abandoned. I sensed that someone had been here recently. The plant was in a state of complete abandonment, but there were traces of recent activity. As I walked through the area, I saw a number of disconnected cables and machines with signs of having been tampered with. In the center of the area, I found it. The machine, or rather, the experiment. It was a large, complex device surrounded by a containment system. Although I could not see clearly what it contained, something inside me told me that this machine should not have been activated. There was something disturbing about its design, something too advanced for the time in which it was built. I looked around the area more closely. There were old reports and documents scattered about, some partially destroyed by time, others barely legible. Nevertheless, I could understand what was going on. What had been a research project at the plant years ago had failed miserably. The idea had been to develop an experimental recycling process based on a material that apparently had unique properties. However, the experiment had gone wrong. The resulting product was uncontrollable, and the personnel who had worked on the project had disappeared or retired without a trace. The report I found, although incomplete, spoke of mutations, unexpected reactions, and biohazards. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was all just a mistake, a project that didn't go as expected. But as I looked at the device and analyzed the reports, something told me that whatever had been locked in that room for so long was much more than just a scientific failure. Whatever had been locked in here was not to be released. And yet, there I was, activating a mechanism I didn't fully understand. My hand trembled as I watched the controls. Despite the warnings, I couldn't stop myself from moving forward. It was my job, and this might be the breakthrough that could save the plant from ruin. Someone wanted me to do it, someone had forced me to do it. But who and why? Suddenly, the sound of an alarm brought me out of my thoughts. The lights flickered, and a screen began to emit a strange noise, a series of incomprehensible numbers and codes. The containment system was failing. Something was breaking free. I pressed the emergency button, but to no avail. The machine began to make a dull thud like a growl, a sound of metal warping. The pressure increased, and the room filled with thick, hot air. Something inside the machine began to move, and suddenly the containment door opened wide. What I saw was not human. It was not a machine. It was a strange mixture of both. Something that was not supposed to exist. It was writhing, moving in an unnatural way. My heart began to pound as I stepped back, feeling the tremendous pressure of the situation. I had created something I could not control, something that was watching me, something that wanted to get out of there and destroy everything it touched. The room was filled with metallic screams. The noise of metal twisting was deafening. With every movement, the walls vibrated, as if they were about to collapse. I tried to run, but the wires were tangled at my feet. The building was collapsing around me, and I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Finally, I made it out of the room, my heart pounding. The plant, which had once been an industrial site, was now a prison of madness. The experiment had escaped their control, and at that moment, I understood the magnitude of what I had done. It had all been planned, but no one had warned me that by reopening Section C-13, I would have unleashed something I couldn't stop. I ran for the exit, but as I looked back, I saw the shadows moving down the hallway and the sound of echoes of something that should never have been released echoed in my ears. The rain was still falling furiously, but now it seemed like a blessing. I knew that if I didn't do something fast, the factory would not only go bankrupt, but the whole city would be in danger. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, but this time I dared not look. I dared not look at what I had released. The storm seemed to have suddenly broken loose, a violent roar that echoed through the deserted streets as my car moved down the road that led me into the unknown. The wind made the trees shake, as if nature itself was warning me. But at that moment, nothing was going to stop me. I had a mission, an obsession that had consumed me for the past few months. My name is David. I'm an urban explorer, and tonight I was going to enter the building that had been drawing my attention for so long, the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city. I had heard stories about the place. Some said it was cursed, some said it was doomed to fall into oblivion, and some even claimed that no one ever came back from it. Of course, these were all rumors that fed my curiosity. It wasn't the first time I had explored abandoned buildings, but something about this place attracted me in an inexplicable way. Every time I passed nearby, something told me that I had to go inside, that I had to know its secrets. The car stopped in front of the iron gate protecting the hospital entrance. The building, visible between the trees, seemed to be expectant, as if waiting for someone to unveil it. The structure was dilapidated, the windows broken, the walls covered by time and decay. But there was no stopping me. My backpack with flashlights, cameras, and ropes was ready. I got out of the car. The sound of the rain was increasing and the cool air seemed sharp. I walked toward the entrance cautiously, pushing the heavy gate that creaked, freeing the passage to what I hoped was just another ruined building. The main entrance was blocked, as expected, but I didn't stop. To one side, a small side door was ajar, and the temptation to just walk in was too strong. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the dampness and musty smell hitting me immediately. The darkness was thick, but my flashlight broke the blackness, illuminating the hallway that stretched before me. The sound of the rain falling outside faded, absorbed by the building, leaving only the echo of my footsteps. There was nothing in the air to suggest that this place was completely abandoned. On the contrary, something told me that I was not alone. I began to explore, room by room. The walls were cracking, the doors were falling off their hinges, and the furnishings were crumbling from the decay of the years. As I moved on, I came across the vestiges of what must once have been a modern facility, but now seemed to be mired in utter abandonment. However, the further I went in, the more I sensed that there was something strange about this place. It wasn't just the decay of the structure or the perpetual bone-chilling cold, but a sense of presences, something latent that I couldn't identify. I walked down several intertwining corridors, my flashlight barely illuminating the peeling brick walls. But then something changed. At the end of the hallway, I noticed a closed door I hadn't seen before. It was iron, thick, with traces of what appeared to be rust, but it was locked with a padlock. However, the lock did not look new. I approached it cautiously and inspected it. Something inside me told me that that door should not be opened, but curiosity as always drove me on. I pulled out the tools I had with me, bent down and began fiddling with the lock. It didn't take long for it to give way, and with a dull click, the door swung open, revealing a dark space. Despite the rain and wind lashing the building, the air in there was surprisingly warm, almost sticky. I cautiously stepped inside and began to explore. The room was in complete darkness, but it wasn't just any room. There were old beds, clothes piled up, and tables covered with objects I couldn't identify at a glance. What struck me most was the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound. I was not alone. Something, or someone, was moving in the darkness. The sound of light footsteps made me turn quickly, pointing my flashlight toward where they were coming from. I saw no one, but I could hear whispers, soft but unmistakable, as if someone was communicating in secret. Sweat began to form on my forehead as I moved slowly forward. Something didn't fit. It couldn't be that this place was completely empty. Suddenly, something moved in front of me, and my heart leapt in my chest. A face appeared in the darkness, but I couldn't make out its features clearly. I could only see glowing eyes fixed on me with a disturbing intensity. My first impulse was to pull back, but something stopped me. I was trapped. The corridors seemed endless, and the door through which I had entered was no longer where I had left it. All I had was my flashlight and my survival instinct. The room was full of other disturbing traces. On the walls, I saw scribbles made with what appeared to be dried blood, strange symbols and stains that I didn't even want to try to understand. Suddenly, the murmurs increased, and they were not only in the room but seemed to be coming from everywhere. The sound of footsteps multiplied and became closer and closer. Something inside me told me that I had to escape, that the building was not empty, that it was not just a simple abandonment. I ran along the corridor, desperately looking for a way out, but the murmurs grew louder and louder, enveloping me, filling me with dread. The footsteps behind me seemed to follow. That's when I saw it. One more door at the end of a dark corridor. I ran towards it, my heart hammering in my chest, not realizing I was not alone. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, eyes watching me from the shadows. With the last of my remaining strength, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the pouring rain. As I turned around, however, I could see the figures that had been following me peering through the window of the building. They were human figures, but their faces were covered by masks, and their bodies seemed to move strangely, as if deformed by something beyond human. I breathed heavily as water poured down my face, drenching me completely. The storm had made it harder to escape, but at least I had made it. Standing shivering and completely wet, I realized that I had been at the center of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. I was not in a simple ruined building. I had witnessed something hidden, a community living on the fringes of society, far from control, fueled by secrets and sadistic acts. The rain was relentless, and as I walked to the car, my mind tried to assimilate what I had discovered. My adventure had been more than I had planned, and unknowingly, I had touched something I should never have touched. The feeling of being watched would not leave me, and the silence of the storm only made it worse. As I drove away from the mansion, I knew I would never forget what I had seen, because something told me that somehow the community in that building was still watching me, waiting for me to return. The rain began to fall heavily just as the plane touched down at the port city's airport. The storm was already raging before we arrived, but the sky darkened even more, as if everything that was happening was a sign. All I could think about was getting to the port, to the place where I was to begin my next project, a task that seemed to be the culmination of my career as a naval architect, designing a ship for a deep-sea scientific expedition. My name is Alan Shaw, a naval architect with over 20 years of experience in the industry. I've worked on everything from luxury yachts to massive cargo ships, but this time it was different. The offer came in a mysterious way, through an anonymous intermediary. The project was confidential, secret, and the reward was generous. I could not resist. I was told of a scientific expedition that required a specialized ship to study the deep sea, unexplored places where sunlight never reaches. The money, the promise of advancing science, and the thrill of building something truly unique were enough to make the decision without too much thought. The port where the ship was to be built was only a few hours away, and after a short road trip, I finally arrived at the naval base where I would be met. The rain was now falling so heavily that the streets had flooded, creating puddles that reflected the city lights. As I got closer, an uneasy feeling began to settle in my stomach. It wasn't fear, but a strange sense of alertness, as if something wasn't right. However, I tried to put those thoughts aside. I would have time to worry later. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a group of impassive-looking men. They were part of the expedition, but they didn't appear to be scientists. Far from it. Instead of typical field suits or lab jackets, they wore military fatigues, camouflage, and heavy boots. Although some smiled at me, most showed no expression, and that puzzled me. I was introduced to the leader of the group, a middle-aged man with a grave face who offered me a firm but cool handshake. His name was Wilson, and he told me that he was in charge of coordinating everything related to the ship. Several days passed in which we discussed the design and technical aspects of the ship. Everything seemed to be in order, but something kept bothering me. There was something about the way they were behaving, as if the real purpose of the expedition was something completely different from what I had been told. In meetings with Wilson, I noticed that he constantly strayed from certain details, and the other team members always seemed to be paying more attention to their own interests than to any real conversation about the project. The first indication that something wasn't right occurred one night, when the wind whipped against the windows of the small hotel where I was staying. I went for a walk, seeking to clear my mind of all the plans and calculations I had been endlessly reviewing. I walked along the shore near the harbor when I saw something strange. A small fishing boat was moored near an abandoned dock, and two men, who appeared to be part of the expedition, were loading large, heavy boxes onto it. It was not normal for nighttime activities to take place without further explanation, especially in such an isolated place. I approached discreetly, trying to understand what they were doing, but the men saw me before I could get any closer. They both looked at me with an alert expression. and one of them nodded his head toward the boat as if indicating that I had better leave. Something told me that I should leave, that I shouldn't go any deeper than necessary, but curiosity overcame my caution. What was really going on? Why were they carrying those boxes? They didn't seem to be scientific supplies. I decided not to inquire further and returned to the hotel, but the restlessness tormented me throughout the night. I couldn't sleep, and my mind was spinning with the idea that there was something deeply murky behind this expedition. The conversations I had had with Wilson and the other team members were vague. Too vague. As the project progressed, I realized that the specifications about the ship became increasingly ambiguous. There were contradictory orders and requests for modifications that made no sense. The pressure from the men coordinating the project was mounting, but always in a subtle way, disguised as scientific urgency. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I went to the shipyard and found the engineers who were working on the plans and construction of the ship. I asked them about the exact purpose of the expedition, but their answers were evasive, as if they were afraid to tell me something I should not hear. They spoke to me of a scientific mission, of the importance of the research, but their tone did not match the words. Something was escaping me, something I didn't want to see. It wasn't until one night after several weeks of work that I finally figured it out. I was reviewing some plans in the shipyard office when someone dropped a set of documents on my desk. At first, I thought it was a simple mistake, a clerical mix-up, but as I looked at the papers more closely, I understood what had happened. One of the documents was marked with a label that read, Expedition 47, Project Abyssus. It was a detailed report that talked about the creation of the ship, but it also included much more obscure aspects. In the pages were references to secret research on the seafloor, on resources thought to be extinct or inaccessible, and one paragraph that immediately caught my attention. It spoke of the exploitation of unidentified elements and the acquisition of biological samples of strategic interest. The project was not only for scientific purposes, there was a much deeper military and economic motivation. At that moment, I understood that the scientists leading the expedition were nothing more than a front. Wilson and his team were not interested in exploring the ocean to learn about it, but to exploit it, to make a discovery that would change the course of history. There was no goodwill in their mission. They were looking for something that was not to be found. And worst of all, by building the ship, I had been part of their plan without even knowing it. The truth hit my mind hard. I was caught in a web of lies and manipulations, and although the project seemed to be for a noble cause, its ends were completely different. What would I do now? I was at a point of no return. If I reported what I knew, I would jeopardize not only my career, but my life. Who could I trust with what I had discovered? The men on the expedition were part of a much larger and more dangerous structure than I could have imagined. The rain was pouring that night, and the sound of the drops hitting the window added to the torrent of thoughts flooding my mind. As I looked over the documents, I realized I had two choices. I could either abandon the project, leave the port and put distance between me and them, or I could face the truth, risk everything to expose what I knew. In the end, I chose what I had to do. I could not stand idly by. I couldn't be part of a plan I didn't fully understand. I made a decision. Later that night, I left the shipyard and headed for the nearest police station. I didn't know if I was making the right decision, but I had to. The truth had to come out for everyone's sake. By telling them what I had discovered, I would not only expose the project, but also a much darker network than I could have imagined. Corruption didn't just exist in government, it had reached deep into the bowels of the ocean where no one thought there could be anything so dangerous. But now, at last, the truth would come out. After 10 years in prison, I knew I had no other way to go. I had no family, no friends, only the desire to rebuild a life that, at one point, had seemed lost forever. The neighborhood I moved to was not luxurious, but it was quiet. The house I rented was on a quiet street with shady trees and well-kept gardens. In the distance, there was the sound of everyday life. Children playing, doors closing, lights flickering. To me, it was all new. I was not used to peace. When I left the prison, the world outside seemed alien, different, as if I had been left behind, as if nothing had changed. But at the same time, everything was altered. My name is Luis, and I used to be someone different. An ex-convict, a man marked by the mistakes of his youth. But now, After so long, I thought it was possible to leave all that behind. However, the nightmare that awaited me in this neighborhood would teach me that there is no escape, that the past never goes away. On the first day, nothing in particular caught my attention. The neighbors seemed friendly, some exchanged kind words, but what I felt from the beginning was a kind of invisible barrier between me and them. They didn't know about me, they didn't know what I had done, and I didn't plan to talk about it. Still, their gaze was never completely welcoming. There was something in the air, something I couldn't quite understand. The first strange encounter occurred one night, after I had become accustomed to the shadows of the neighborhood. It was close to 10 o'clock and I was alone in my house watching an old black and white movie I had found in a thrift store. The rain was still coming down hard and thunder rumbled in the sky, filling the air with palpable tension. At first it was just a faint sound, as if someone was walking outside in the dark. I thought it was the wind, but soon the footsteps became clearer, closer. I stepped out onto the porch and looked out onto the empty street, illuminated only by the lights on the poles. Nothing, just the rain and the echo of thunder. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the gloom. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound out of place kept me alert. The next morning, everything seemed to be in its place as if nothing had happened. But that feeling of being watched did not dissipate. On the contrary, it grew with each passing day in the neighborhood. I began to notice strange things. In the evenings, I would see the same neighbors gathered in small groups, their conversations murmured, as if they didn't want to be heard. Always in the same houses, always with the same people. There were no unexpected visitors, just them. No one seemed to arrive or leave, as if they were all trapped in an endless routine. Although I couldn't understand why, I felt uncomfortable. There was something unsettling in their faces, in the way they looked at each other, in their gestures, as if they all shared a secret. The nights grew longer. Every sound out of place made me shiver. I began to see figures moving through the windows of nearby houses, always late at night. I didn't know what was going on, but I felt I was getting closer to something, to a hidden truth that no one wanted me to discover. One night, when I hadn't slept well for days, I heard a loud noise coming from the house on the corner. It was one of the largest in the neighborhood, with a metal gate surrounding it. No one ever came out or went in, and the house always seemed empty. But that night, the lights were on and I could hear voices. They weren't shouting or arguing, but the way they spoke, the tone of their voices, it was something I couldn't understand. I decided to investigate. I approached the gate slowly, walking stealthily. I didn't know what I expected to find, but curiosity, the same curiosity that had gotten me into trouble in the past, pushed me forward. From a distance, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. I watched as the figures moved in a strange pattern, as if they were dancing or performing some kind of ritual. It was not a typical neighborhood gathering. It didn't look like a party or a chat among friends. There was something else, something that didn't fit. A shiver ran down my spine, but something inside me told me I had to know what was going on there. What I didn't know was that my presence had not gone unnoticed. I felt a pressure in the air, as if suddenly everything had stopped. As I turned to leave, I saw someone in the darkness. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he had been watching me. I felt a shiver run through my body and a sense that I had been discovered. Over the next few days, things got worse. My neighbors began to behave more strangely, as if they were deliberately avoiding me. The greetings became more curt, the stares more intense, and then the calls started. At first, it was just a few unknown numbers that hung up as soon as I answered. At first, I thought they were just telephone pranks, but after the fifth call, the uncomfortable feeling turned to paranoia. I began to investigate. I searched for information about the neighborhood and its history. I discovered that in the past, the area had been the center of several rumors. In previous decades, several of the residents had mysteriously left, disappearing without a trace. There were no records of them with the local authorities. They all lived in the older houses, the ones no one wanted to touch. The house on the corner, the one I had been watching, had belonged to a family known for their strange practices. There were rumors that they had connections to a secret cult, one that operated in the shadows, unbeknownst to anyone. As my investigation progressed, I realized the magnitude of what was going on. The neighbors, those friendly people I had tried to blend in with, were part of something much darker. There was a cult that had infiltrated every corner of the community. Every neighbor was part of it. And I, an ex-convict, someone without family or allies, had become the target. One night, after not sleeping for days, something happened. I was at home trying to find a solution to escape when the door to my house burst open. I knew I hadn't left the door open. I quickly got up, and when I looked, I saw the shadows on the threshold. It was them, the neighbors. They had come for me. The final blow was that apparently everything I had lived through up to that point was nothing but a sham. They knew about my past. They had known from the beginning. My mistake was believing that I could escape, that I could start over. But the cult was not forgiving. There was no forgiveness for someone like me, not in a place like this. My name is Eduardo Sanchez, and although I have been a journalist for years at one of the best investigative magazines in the country, I never imagined that I would end up searching for the truth in the dusty corridors of my own past. Sometimes fate takes it upon itself to return you to places you thought you had left behind. And in my case, that return began when I received a letter with no return address. It was not common to receive something like that, especially in times where everything is handled by email or instant messaging. The letter had a simple inscription: "The truth awaits you at the old house." When I saw it, I knew something was wrong. I had spent most of my life away from my family, not out of spite, but because I walked away looking for a purpose, something fulfilling. I had grown up in a house with a lot of secrets. My father had been a reserved, distant man, always with a somber look on his face. My mother died when I was very young, and from then on, my relationship with my father became increasingly strained. Until finally, a few years before he passed away, I decided to leave. The house the letter spoke of was on the outskirts of the city, a place that had always seemed to me to be secluded from the world. I had spent my early years there, but it had been more than 2 decades since I had last set foot there. However, something inside me urged me to go. The desire to know what was behind that letter, to find out why I was being called to that place, compelled me to take the car and travel there. The rain did not stop on the way, and as I drove along the road, the darkness of the storm seemed to envelop everything around me, as if the world itself was about to swallow my decision. When I finally reached the old house, the air was permeated with dampness. The windows were dirty, and the front door, which once must have been majestic, was weathered by the passage of time. There was no trace of life, not a single light on inside. As I approached the entrance, I noticed that the lock was intact. My father had been a cautious man. He had always kept the keys to everything, including this house. But something told me that if I wanted to know the truth, I had to go in. The threshold was covered with dust and cobwebs. No one had been there in years, and the house reflected it. The furniture was covered by white sheets, and the walls, once a warm color, now showed deep cracks. I couldn't help but feel that there was something unsettling in the air. A feeling that wasn't just due to the decay of the place, but something else. Something that had been there for a long time. I walked through the house slowly, cautiously, as if a bad omen hovered over each room. The letter gave no further clues. It only said that I should find something in the place. But what? Everything seemed empty, empty of life, empty of answers. That's when I reached the basement. The door was closed, but there was no trace of dust on the knob, as if someone had been there recently. My heart began to beat faster as I pushed the door open with effort. The darkness of the basement came over me instantly. I carefully descended the stairs, using my phone as a flashlight. At first, everything seemed normal. Old boxes, some tools my father had probably used in his time, an old table covered with junk. But something didn't fit. In a corner of the basement, hidden behind an old table, I found a door I couldn't remember ever seeing in my childhood. My breathing quickened as I approached it. The door was locked, but something told me I should open it. And I did. What I found on the other side changed my life forever. The room was brighter than the rest of the basement, thanks to a lamp that still worked, albeit intermittently. At first, everything seemed to be in order, but upon closer inspection, I noticed that the floor was covered in what looked like dried bloodstains. On the walls, something was written in what appeared to be a dark substance, possibly the same blood that had stained the floor. What I was reading made my blood run cold. The names of several members of our family were written with eerie precision, along with dates and numbers. But the most terrifying thing was not the names, but the last words written on the wall: "Debt is paid with life." I staggered, as if the air had become thicker. My mind was trying to comprehend what I was seeing, but my body had already begun to react. I couldn't stay there, but an invisible force kept me there. The light of the lamp flickered once more before it went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. My mind began to wander. What had my family done? What secrets had they been keeping all this time? My mind began to connect the dots. My father, his absences, his eyes charged with something I never knew how to describe. I began to recall stories of family members who had disappeared without explanation. People who, rumor had it, were connected to something dark, something beyond what anyone could imagine. I rushed out of the basement, my breathing quickening as fear consumed me. The feeling that something had gone wrong, that I was about to unveil a secret too big to handle, haunted me. Suddenly I heard a noise coming from the hallway. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The house was empty, or so I thought. What I discovered later that night as I walked back to my car left me speechless. In the darkness of the storm, something moved in the shadows. A figure, human, with a familiar silhouette, approached me. I couldn't see who it was, but as I looked closer, a familiar face peered out from over the hood I was wearing. It was someone who had been part of my family years ago, someone who had disappeared without a trace. My heart stopped for a moment. My family's secret was not just a matter of the past. What I had discovered was not only part of a forgotten history, but a web of crimes that had been covered up for years. My family had not only kept secrets, but had been part of a series of macabre events, a cycle of deaths and betrayals that never ceased to exist. What awaited me now was not only the revelation of the truth, but the decision of what to do with it. The storm outside was intensifying, and I found myself trapped in a place where the answers were darker than I could have imagined. The cold, persistent rain kept me awake, deep in thought, as I watched the drops slide down the glass as if each one was trying to tell me something I didn't yet understand. I wasn't tired, but there was something in the air, something in that rain, that made me feel that what was about to happen was inevitable. Something that had started long before I joined the book club. It all started with a simple ad in the newspaper. The title was tempting: Book Club, True Crimes. Curiosity led me to call. I had always liked crime books, especially those based on true events, but I never thought I would be part of something so strange, so disturbing. I thought it would be a common group, with readers passionate about the most emblematic cases, but I was wrong. The first meeting was in a small bookstore on the outskirts of the city, a cozy place, but with a somewhat gloomy atmosphere. The shelves were full of dusty books, and the air had the characteristic smell of old pages. An aroma that, for me, had always been comforting, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The club members were few, maybe 6 or 7, each with their own air of mystery. They weren't so interested in the familiar faces of famous crimes. Instead, they discussed obscure cases, cases forgotten by the public, shadowy tales that no one usually talked about. At first, I thought it was all just part of a penchant for crime literature, but something in their eyes, in the way they spoke, made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just that they were interested in the details of the crimes, but in the way they described them, almost as if they knew the tragedy up close. The first few meetings were simple. We talked about books, about haunting stories of killers who were never caught, about victims forgotten by society. But as time went on, the conversations became more intense. The stories we discussed became more personal, more relatable. Each story seemed to have something that resonated with me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, as if the words in those books were not just describing events that had happened in the past, but were somehow becoming intertwined with my own life. The first sign that something wasn't right occurred when one of the members mentioned a crime that happened in my neighborhood more than 10 years ago. A woman was brutally murdered in her home. The case was never solved. For weeks, newspaper headlines filled the pages with speculation, but there was never an answer. I lived near that area at the time. I remember the feeling of fear that pervaded the city. The streets used to be full of people, but after that crime they became empty, as if everyone was waiting for the next hit. I couldn't believe my ears. The book we were discussing that night talked about precisely that crime. Every detail of the murder was eerily familiar, the way the victim had been found, the personal items that disappeared without a trace. But what made me shudder was what came next. One of the members, without looking directly at me, began to talk about a possible suspect, someone who had been near the crime scene, someone who had never been thoroughly investigated. What he described took my breath away. It sounded like he was talking about me. At that moment, I felt the air become thick, as if the room had suddenly shrunk. I tried to remain calm, to dissimulate, but something told me that these coincidences were not. That story, that crime, could not be just a coincidence. The conversation continued, but I was in a state of shock, as if the words were reaching my ears through a veil. When the meeting ended, I left immediately without saying goodbye, without wanting to talk to anyone. That night, the rain came down harder. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. My mind was filled with images, with memories of that time when I lived close to the crime. For days, I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the details kept on haunting my head, as if someone was playing with my life, as if the club members knew more than they were saying. In the weeks that followed, I felt trapped in a maze from which I couldn't escape. Each meeting I attended left me more uneasy. The cases they discussed not only coincided with events I had experienced or heard about firsthand, but seemed to be increasingly connected to my own story. My name appeared in the stories, in the whispers of conversation, as if they were constantly watching me, as if my movements were part of the game, part of a macabre puzzle I never asked to solve. There was something strange about the behavior of the club members. They seemed to have knowledge beyond the normal. Sometimes when someone mentioned a new case, I noticed quick glances, subtle gestures among them. It wasn't just that they were interested in the crimes, it was that they seemed to know two specific details that only those involved in the case would know. The storm that night was worse than ever. The sound of the rain covered every other noise, and as I walked to the bookstore for the last meeting, I couldn't help but feel that something was going to happen. Something I had been waiting for from the beginning. Something I couldn't escape. As I arrived, I found the door ajar. The club members were already there, and they all looked at me as I entered. They said nothing, but the silence was heavier than ever. That night, we would not be discussing a book. The atmosphere was different, more tense, more charged. The lamp in the center of the room flickered, as if the place itself was waiting for something. I knew that would be the night I would find out what was really going on. The conversation started with a seemingly harmless topic, but soon changed. One of the members started talking about an old case, a case I had forgotten about years ago. A missing man, an unsolved murder, details that seemed to be mere coincidences, but were beginning to fit together all too well. The connection to my own life became apparent when they began to describe a key witness, a witness who had never been interviewed but had been close to the scene. The words hit me like a hammer. In that instant, I knew there was no turning back. These were not just coincidences. The club members weren't there to discuss books, they were there to talk about me, to play with my mind. The air in the room became thick and a cold sweat ran down my back. The details of the crimes were not just fictions, they were part of a macabre game they had been preparing for years. Each of the stories was designed to make me question my own life, to make me doubt my own history. The rain was still falling furiously over the city, but I could no longer hear the sound. At that moment, all I could hear was the echo of his words. I knew I had entered into something far more dangerous than I had imagined, a game I could no longer escape, a truth I never asked to discover, but now had no choice but to face. And as the shadows in the room lengthened and the rain continued to hit the glass, I understood that I could never escape from what they knew. I remember the day I agreed to treat Rafael Torres, a man in his 40s with a pale face and restless eyes. He came to my office with a medical history that did not say much. It was a common case, apparently. Amnesia patients are usually a mixture of bewilderment and despair, but they also bring with them an opportunity to rewrite their history, to give them a new beginning, a new direction in their lives. That's what I thought when I received his file, but I never imagined what I would find behind his empty words and lost look. Rafael came recommended by a colleague, a psychiatrist who had worked with him briefly in a specialized clinic. According to what she told me, Rafael had suffered an accident several months ago, and since then he could not remember anything about his life before that date. He had lost all memories of his childhood, his adolescence, his family. He only remembered fragments of what had happened day by day since the accident. His amnesia seemed to be related to a psychological trauma, not a physical one, something that had been left in his mind like a crack impossible to repair. The first meeting was uneventful. As always, I began with general questions, seeking the basis for understanding his situation. Raphael was polite, but his response was erratic, as if he could not hold his own thoughts. He would say things like, "I don't remember anything from before," or, "It all seems like a dream." And although there was nothing out of the ordinary in his answers, I felt something was wrong. My intuition, the one that over the years I had learned to listen to, was telling me that not everything he was saying was true. There was something behind his words that didn't add up. With each subsequent session, I delved deeper into his broken mind, trying to piece together what his life had been like before the accident. But something disturbed me more and more. Her memories were fragmented, yes, but the pieces that came together in her narrative didn't seem to belong to a normal life. There were vague details that didn't fit, as if he didn't have the same memories that someone his age should have. Sometimes he would mention names, places, and events that could not be found in any record. At first I thought they were delusions caused by amnesia, but as the weeks progressed, I began to be disturbed by a pattern in her accounts. One day, in the middle of a particularly difficult session, Raphael mentioned something that chilled my blood. He said almost offhandedly that he didn't remember ever being arrested, but that something in him told him he had been, that he felt he had been locked up. His words, though empty, fell like a weight on my mind. Why would he have had that feeling? Why had he mentioned the lockup if he didn't remember the details? Something didn't add up. He was not the first amnesia patient I had treated, but never before had I had that feeling that there was something dark, something deeper in his words. From that point on, I began to review his history in more detail. Every hospital visit, every change in treatment, every reference in her file seemed to be shrouded in a veil of fog, as if it had been erased from history. I couldn't help but search the police records. It was then that I found what I had been avoiding. Rafael Torres's file was linked to an unsolved homicide case, a murder that occurred years before the accident. The victim, a man named Joaquin Fernandez, had been found in his home with multiple stab wounds. The investigation had been unsuccessful and the case had been closed. What was strange was not only the murder itself, but the details surrounding the case. According to police reports, Rafael Torres had been one of the main suspects. However, he had never been arrested or prosecuted. The case had been stalled, marked as unconfirmed suspicion. The human mind can erase many things, but forgetting is only a layer that covers what we are really afraid to face. Terrified by what I had discovered, I faced the bigger question. Was it possible that Raphael had been involved in that crime, and his mind had completely blocked it out? Or was he faking amnesia to hide something much darker? I had to be cautious. I could not allow my assumptions to go beyond the facts. I began to ask him more direct questions in the sessions. I didn't mention the murder, of course, but I tried to delve deeper into his memories. I would ask him about his life before the accident, about his family, his friends, his work. But his answers were always vague, imprecise. And yet, at times, when he mentioned the police or the investigators, something in his tone changed. His gaze would harden for a second, and an expression of fear, of regret perhaps, would cross his face before it quickly disappeared. One afternoon, as it was raining hard outside, Raphael made a comment that made it clear there was something more. We were talking about a recurring dream he had been having, something about being trapped in a dark place with no way out. Without meaning to, he said, "I've been in places like that before, but I don't know if I should remember what happened. I don't want to remember." His voice trembled a little and a cold sweat covered his forehead. That's when I knew he wasn't faking it. Something had marked him. Something had happened in his life before the accident that had been so traumatic, so destructive, that it had driven his mind to erase any trace of what had happened. Finally, I decided to do what I had to do, confront him with the truth, even though I was not prepared for what I discovered. The next day, I showed him the police reports I had found. I told him that I knew about the murder of Joaquin Fernandez, and that I was sure there was some connection between him and the case. What happened from there was disconcerting. Raphael did not react as I expected. There were no denials or attempts at defense. Instead, his face emptied of expression, and for a few long seconds, he didn't say a word. I watched him, expecting him to break the silence with genuine confusion or an apology, but he did not. Finally, his eyes slowly rose to mine. His face was filled with infinite sadness. "I know what you're thinking," he said in a low, almost inaudible voice. "But I'm not a monster. I'm not." His response left me paralyzed. I wasn't sure what he meant, but the sincerity of his gaze made me doubt everything I thought. It was then that I understood that somehow, Raphael knew more than he was willing to admit. There was something in his memories, something so terrifying and so deep that he had done everything he could to block it out. He didn't want to remember what happened, not because he was guilty, but because he couldn't live with the truth. The amnesia was not an escape, but a response to a pain so deep that his mind had created a barrier between him and what had really happened. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. I tried to help Raphael, but the case took turns that even I could not anticipate. Memories kept surfacing, fragments of what I had done, what had happened that fateful night. I wasn't sure if Raphael had been the killer, or if something darker had intervened in his life, but his story of amnesia was not just an escape. It was the consequence of something far more terrible. The truth gradually came to light. What happened that night was not just a murder. It was a series of events triggered by desperation, betrayal, and violence. A web of crimes in which Raphael had been trapped, but not by choice. However, although justice eventually found its way, Raphael's memory was never repaired. The psychological damage he had suffered marked him in an irreparable way. Today, years later, I can't help but wonder if I will ever fully understand the extent of what I discovered. The human mind is a strange place, and sometimes what we want to forget is the only thing we need to remember. I never believed in coincidence, not with so many similar cases, not with so many disappearances that somehow shared the same pattern. The neighborhood was full of elegant mansions, manicured gardens, and clean streets. It didn't look like the kind of place where tragedies would be expected, but it was. 3 people disappeared in less than a month. 3 people with seemingly normal lives who never had any problems, but who suddenly disappeared without a trace. The first to disappear was Laura, a single mother, owner of a small local art store. She had endeared herself to everyone in the neighborhood by her kindness, but after she disappeared, the neighbors spoke in whispers. No one had heard or seen anything. No one had any clues. Then it was the turn of Tomas, a respected businessman. He had lectured all over the country and had made a name for himself in his industry. No one could imagine that something dark lurked in his life. The third was Eva, the wife of a prominent local lawyer, a man who had made his fortune in defending clients with powerful connections. Her disappearance, however, was different. It was not so subtle. The police found traces of blood in her home, but they were unable to determine what had happened. I was called in to investigate after the local police stalled. Eva's disappearance had raised more suspicions. The neighborhood was full of whispers and rumors. Something didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was going on here in this seemingly spotless neighborhood. Everything seemed perfect at first glance, but it was clear that someone wanted to hide something. My first stop was Laura's house. The police had searched the property, but hadn't found more than a couple of footprints in the driveway. No one seemed to know anything. I stayed there for hours, checking the surroundings. I wasn't looking for obvious clues, but for something else, something the others missed. It was at dusk when I found it, a small detail almost imperceptible on the corner of the back door. It was a scratch, as if someone had tried to force it. No one had mentioned this before, not the police, not the residents, not even the witnesses. I went back to Tomas's house. At first, it seemed to me that there was nothing to explore, but I remembered a comment from one of the neighbors that had caught my attention. They were talking about a secret meeting of businessmen that was taking place in a nearby mansion, one of those big houses with endless gardens. No one had seen the attendees, but they knew that Tomas sometimes attended these meetings. I made a mental note of that and headed for the mansion. The iron gates were closed, but a small crack in the wall allowed me to sneak in through the side. The mansion was silent, and the darkness grew thicker as I went deeper into it. There was a large library with shelves full of books and papers scattered on the floor. Something caught my eye. Among the papers, I found a contract. It was firmly sealed. But what interested me was not the content of the contract itself, but the names of the parties involved. Tomas was there, signing along with other names, names I had never heard of, but which seemed unusually familiar. That same night, I checked out the connections among the other residents of the neighborhood. It was no secret that they all seemed to know each other. Most of them were involved in charity work, but something told me there were more. I decided to investigate further and dug into the local archives, looking for any clues. That's when I found a list of names of people who had disappeared in the past, all linked to the neighborhood. It seemed that each of them had had some sort of connection to prominent figures still living in the area. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I discovered that many of these missing people had been employees of companies that were connected to local businessmen. They were all people who somehow knew too much. It had not been a simple game of chance. Each missing person had had some kind of compromising information about the business being conducted in the area. The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to become more tense. There was something in the air, something that could not be denied. The neighbors didn't seem to have much interest in talking to me, and the few that did seemed unaware of what was going on, almost as if they were protecting something. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't ignore. Finally, I returned to Eva's house. The police had done their job, but there was something I couldn't understand. After examining the house again, I realized that there was a second secret entrance in the basement. It was hidden behind a bookshelf, and no one seemed to have noticed it. When I opened it, I found something I hadn't expected: a series of old records. They were records of secret meetings, where prominent figures in the neighborhood met to talk about shady business. But there was also something else: photos of missing persons, with dates and places noted in the margins. The horror I felt at that moment was not just from what I saw, but from the realization of what had happened. These people had not disappeared by accident. They had been sacrificed, disappeared because they knew too much. The network of corruption that had been operating for years in the neighborhood had done everything possible to keep it hidden. The residents of the neighborhood were part of a closed elite circle, a circle that did not tolerate failure or threats to its power. Every time someone started asking questions, someone disappeared. It was a repetitive cycle, and now I found myself trapped in it. I had no choice but to face the truth, but I knew it was too late to stop them. The people still left in the neighborhood were too protected by their power, by their influence. As I tried to escape, I realized that someone had been watching me. Every step I took seemed to be being anticipated, and it wasn't the police doing it, but someone much closer. It was a trap. The names in the records, the photos in the basement, everything had led me to this moment. I had been just another piece in a macabre game, and I couldn't escape. Those who had gone missing were not just victims, they were part of a truth that no one wanted to face. The disappearances were not accidents. They were carefully calculated murders to protect the darkest secrets of a community that thought itself untouchable. But what they didn't know was that in the end, someone would always discover the truth. Although my life was no longer safe, the neighborhood could no longer hide what I had done. I never imagined that something as common as a phone call could change my life forever. But that night proved me otherwise. I was in my living room alone like so many other nights. I had started watching a movie, but not even the sound of the action-packed screen could distract me from the weight of stillness that had taken over my life lately. The phone began to ring. It was an unfamiliar number, one I didn't recognize, but something in me told me I should answer. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe the feeling that something important was about to happen. The truth is that at that instant, I made the decision to answer, not knowing that that moment would mark the beginning of something much darker than I had imagined. I answered, expecting to hear the voice of someone I knew, maybe a wrong call, something trivial. But what came from the other end was not what I expected. It was a soft voice which almost seemed to whisper, but somehow paralyzed me in my seat. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was that of David, my lifelong friend, the man who had disappeared months ago. No one had heard from him. The police had done their job, but they had found no trace. How was it possible? Was it a mistake, or was it really him? The call was brief, but his tone and the words he spoke stunned me. He asked me to go to a secluded place, guided by a map he would send me. Something didn't add up, but I couldn't resist the feeling that I should follow the trail, that I should go. Maybe there was still something I didn't understand, something that only he could explain to me. And if it was true, if he really was alive, or if there was still a clue to his disappearance, then I had to act. The rain began to fall the moment I decided to set out. The sound of water hitting the roof of my car was the only thing that accompanied my journey along the secondary road that led me to the point indicated on the map. It was a remote area, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As I got closer, the darkness intensified, and the landscape around me seemed to become denser, as if I was entering a place where I wasn't supposed to be. The map guided me to a clearing in the middle of a thick forest, where there was no sign of life, only the overwhelming nature and the rain that fell relentlessly. I felt vulnerable, as if the whole environment was warning me to stay away. Yet I kept going, my footsteps slipping on the mud as I moved deeper into the forest, searching for answers, searching for David. In the silence of the night, I came across something strange. A glowing object on the ground, partially covered by dirt and leaves. As I approached it, my heart almost stopped as I recognized what it was. A cell phone. I picked it up with trembling hands, convinced it was his. Turning it on, I found no recent messages, but the phone was full of photos. The pictures showed the same area I was in, but there was something else in them. Blurry figures, unfamiliar men, and places I didn't recognize but seemed to have been observing with eerie precision. My mind began to work at full speed, searching for an explanation. Something was not right. The presence of that phone in that remote location could only mean one thing. Someone else had been there before me, and that person knew I would be there too. It was clear that I was not alone. A rustling in the distance brought me out of my thoughts. I looked around, but the thick fog and rain made it difficult to see. Something was moving through the trees, and my instinct screamed at me that I should leave. However, anxiety paralyzed me, and a deep fear began to run through me when I felt a presence behind me. I tried to run, but my feet slipped in the mud and the sound of the rain enveloped me completely. Suddenly, I felt myself gripped tightly, as if an invisible hand had held me back. Turning around, I saw a man with a somber face, whose appearance was completely unfamiliar to me. His gaze was cold, empty, and his presence seemed to be made to instill fear. It was then that I understood that all this had been a trap from the beginning. The clues, the phone, the call, everything had led me to that moment. I was the next victim. I was dragged to a hut hidden in the trees, a place that looked like something out of a nightmare. Memories of the call, of the map, of the photos, everything was crumbling in my mind as I was pulled into the darkness of that place. There was no escape. I was trapped in a web of deceit, and there was no way out. Everything had been calculated. David's phone, the clues, the call. It was a well-crafted trap, and I had fallen into it without being able to stop myself. As the shadows enveloped me, I realized that the search for answers had led me straight to my doom. David's phone had been the beginning, but now I was the next to disappear. After hours of driving on the empty road, I began to feel exhausted. Thick fog covered the road, creating a dense atmosphere as if I was trapped in an endless tunnel. I had left early in the morning, but the lack of breaks and the monotony of the landscape were playing tricks on me. My fatigued mind was beginning to play tricks on me, and every sound inside the car seemed to be amplified in the darkness. However, in the distance, I managed to see a sign indicating the proximity of a gas station. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, but as I got closer, I realized how lonely it seemed. The gas station was located on the side of the road, isolated from any population. The lights flickered intermittently, giving it a ghostly air. Although I didn't like the idea of stopping in such a desolate place, the fatigue was too much and I couldn't continue driving without a short break. I sped up the car, looking for a place to park. It was the kind of place one would hardly stop if one had no other choice. The roof of the small gas station store looked dirty and the windows were fogged up from the moisture emanating from the cold air. When I parked, the sound of the engine shutting off left me with a strange feeling, as if something in the atmosphere wasn't right. Despite the light rain that began to fall, I decided to get out of the car and head for the store. The door was rickety, and I was surprised that the gas station was open in the middle of nowhere. But I figured someone must be there even though I saw no signs of life. I stopped in front of the counter and looked at the shelves full of products that looked like they had been there for years. I decided to take a bottle of mineral water and pay for it. The silence inside the store was absolute, and the only company I had was the sound of raindrops hitting the roof and the metal walls. As I waited, I felt a presence behind me. As I turned around, I saw a man who had crept up behind me. His appearance was disheveled, his clothes wet from the rain and his face partially covered by a cap that didn't let me see much of him. I didn't know if I had been watching him since I arrived or if he just appeared the moment I was distracted. I couldn't help a shiver that ran down my back. The man looked at me with an uncomfortable intensity, then spoke as if he was waiting for me. He asked if he could give me a ride north. I didn't think much of his request at first. My exhaustion was such that I didn't care whether he knew me or not. Somehow the thought of sharing the ride with someone was a little reassuring. I had spent hours driving alone, and although something inside me told me I shouldn't accept, exhaustion got the better of me. I nodded and without another word left the tent and followed him to his car. The vehicle was a dark sedan, one of those that didn't attract attention but could also go unnoticed. I climbed into the passenger seat and although it seemed strange, I felt too exhausted to worry about the details. The man started the engine without a word, and as we drove down the deserted road, the rain increased in intensity, making the trip even more somber. At first, everything seemed normal. A few trivial comments about the weather and the road made me feel a little more comfortable. However, I soon began to notice something strange about his behavior. Although he spoke in a perfunctory manner, his answers were curt, as if he wanted to get rid of any deeper conversation. Whenever I tried to ask about his destination or make any personal comments, he would simply change the subject with an almost calculated skill. This made me uneasy, but again I felt too tired to worry too much about it. The journey grew longer as we drove deeper into the darkness. The lonely road stretched before us like an endless tunnel, and the rain gave no respite. Suddenly, the man's tone changed. He stopped talking about the weather or the road and started asking strange questions, mostly about life and human nature. He asked if I'd ever thought about what I would do if I were completely alone in the world. His words, though harmless on the surface, began to feel invasive, as if he was trying to gauge my reaction to something. I tried to ignore it, but discomfort took over. It was then that something in his gaze changed. His face, previously expressionless, became more serious and calculating. I didn't look directly at him, but I felt his eyes not leaving me, as if he was watching my every move, my every reaction. The air inside the car seemed to become thicker, and even though the rain was pounding hard on the windshield, the feeling of discomfort intensified. The man began to talk about darker things. He told me that people live deceived, that we all have secrets, and that deep down we are all guilty of something. These words shook me, but I tried to remain calm. The road was deserted, and my only company was him, a stranger whose presence had become increasingly oppressive. At that moment, the idea of having accepted the ride began to seem like a terrible decision. Something wasn't right, and I didn't know what to do to undo it. Suddenly, the car took a detour. The road stopped being straight and started to become more winding, more closed. The landscape was getting darker and darker, as if we were driving into a place from which there was no way out. I looked out the window, and the surroundings seemed strange, as if everything around us was a mirage, something built just to trap us in its net. At that moment, I felt the urge to run away, but the car kept moving forward, and I didn't know what to do. When the man started talking about his job, I understood that I had made a mistake by getting into that car. His words were not confusing, but they were clear enough for me to realize what he was saying. He had been involved in horrible things, crimes so dark and so despicable that I couldn't even process it. I realized that in a way he had been testing me, gauging how much I knew, how much I could control my thoughts. The serial killer hiding under that facade of a normal man was there, sitting next to me, while I was helpless. Cold sweat began to break out on my forehead. Every word that came out of his mouth was like a rope that was entangling me more and more in his macabre game. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me or if I was really in danger, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to get out of there if I didn't make a quick decision. And just as my heart was pounding in my chest, I heard something distant, the sound of sirens. At first I didn't recognize it, but then I realized they were approaching fast. The man heard it too, and his expression immediately changed. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, and his face tightened. I knew the time for his escape had come, but the police had arrived just in time. I saw the lights of the roadblock in the distance, and without thinking, I shouted for help. The car braked abruptly. The man tried to turn around, but the police were already there, surrounding the vehicle. They helped me out, and at that moment, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. The man could not escape, and as they arrested him, he stared straight ahead with a blank stare, as if he didn't care what happened to him. Finally, I took refuge in the patrol car. I didn't know how it had happened or why the police were there at that precise moment, but I was grateful for every second of their presence. I had survived, but something inside me knew I would never be the same. The road, the fog, and that man, it would all stick in my mind, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It was clear that the man knew her routine, that he had been following her. The words hit me like a hammer blow. He had never mentioned it to anyone, and I never imagined it had come to such a pass. Worst of all, Claudia, out of fear, had decided not to tell me anything. She had been alone facing something so monstrous, so terrifying, and I never knew. My heart was pounding as I read on. Somehow I felt like I was entering a nightmare from which I could not escape. Suddenly, the words seemed to fill the room, as if they could materialize into shadows lurking from around corners. In her diary, Claudia had done something she couldn't understand. She had begun to track the man, to trace his movements, to investigate his identity. In her writings, she mentioned the new threats with trepidation, but also something that left me cold. I think I know him. I don't know how, but I think I know him. The next step in his research was to find his name. He didn't know how he did it, but he managed to get it. At first, the details were vague, confusing, but over time the pieces began to fit together. The man, whose identity was hidden behind a facade of normalcy, had been an old acquaintance, someone Claudia had known in her youth, but who had disappeared from her life without a trace. A man with a dark past, one full of shadows that no one dared touch. Reading about his background, I understood why Claudia had been so afraid. The man had a criminal record, multiple accusations of violence and harassment, but he had always managed to evade justice. On a couple of occasions he had been arrested, but the charges had not been solid enough to put him in jail. This monster disguised as a common man, had returned to make his life miserable. The last pages of the diary were filled with despair. Claudia had stopped writing with the same regularity, and her words were becoming more and more disjointed, disorganized. I felt I was losing her in those pages, as if she was slowly crumbling under the weight of her own fear. My mind was trapped in the words of the diary, and an irrational rage began to grow in me. This man had destroyed my wife's life, had marked each of her days with his presence, and in the end, he had taken it all so far that I couldn't help but wonder if somehow her death had been the result of his harassment. I knew the answer lay in the pages of the diary, but I was not yet ready to face them. As my thoughts became troubled, I made a decision. I had to find this man. If Claudia couldn't do it in life, I would. I delved into her research, searching for answers with the same obsession she had had. It was a search that consumed me. I began to trace her history, to follow the clues she had left in her diary. Weeks passed, and the obsession to uncover the truth became my only reason for moving forward. At every step, the terror of what I might discover haunted me. The feeling of being watched never went away, and with each passing day I moved deeper into the darkness. Finally, I managed to locate it. He was not far away in a neighboring city, in a neighborhood forgotten by time where the shadows seemed to be thicker. I approached his house cautiously, and as I got closer, I could feel danger weaving around me. By the time I reached his door, my breathing was heavy and my pulse was thundering in my ears. But then, as I looked at myself in the reflection of a broken window, I understood something. I hadn't just been looking for the man who had harassed my wife. I had been looking for someone who could have destroyed me as well. The fear Claudia had felt was now mine. The door opened. A stern-faced man stared at me, and his eyes glowed with an intensity I recognized immediately. The face I had feared all my life was in front of me. The last thing I remember is how he dragged me inside the house, a cold, cruel smile on his face. It no longer mattered what happened, because at that moment, the obsession that had been born in me had pushed me over the edge. I had unleashed something I could not control. The rain did not stop. It had begun to fall in the afternoon, fine and persistent, with that feeling that it would never stop. The sound of the windows hit by the drops accompanied me as I drove to the community center. The road was empty, and on the horizon only the gray of the clouds could be seen. The city seemed immersed in a stillness that I could not explain. Perhaps it was the same sense of hopelessness that had been haunting me since my sister disappeared 6 months ago. I joined the support group on the recommendation of an acquaintance, someone who claimed to understand what I was feeling, although I wasn't so sure about it. I had always been skeptical of these types of groups, thinking they were nothing more than a place where people gathered to grieve. But since Laura's disappearance, all I had done was try to keep up the same pace of life, hoping to find some clue, to find her. I was exhausted, emotionally, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. So, in the end, I decided to go with the slight hope that perhaps sharing my pain with others would help me find some peace. The place I was headed to was unimpressive, an ordinary brick building on the outskirts of downtown with a sign that read, Family Support Center. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. The support group was gathered in a large room with rain-fogged windows. Tables and chairs were arranged in a circle, and on them were sheets of paper and pens. The smell of coffee was in the air, mixed with a faint musty aroma coming from outside. Members were scattered around the room, some already seated, others standing, looking at each other with the same mixture of distrust and despair I felt. There was something in the air that immediately made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just the shared pain, it was the tension, as if each of us was waiting for a sign, something to tell us that everything would be okay. I sat in a corner, as I always did in these places. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but at the same time I felt the need to understand if anyone else was going through what I was going through, if we shared the same helplessness in not having answers. The moderator began to speak, a woman with a calm but tired look. She explained how the meeting would work. Everyone was to share whatever they wanted, no pressure, no expectations. There was something in her tone that did not convince me, as if she had lost all hope that the group could help. One by one, people began to talk. Their stories varied, but there was a common theme. People who had disappeared without a trace. Some were parents, some siblings, some close friends. There was a palpable sense of loss, but also a sense of not knowing what to do with that pain. No clues, no witnesses, no answers. My turn came late after several testimonies, and though it was hard for me to speak, I did. I introduced myself and shared the little I knew about Laura, her disappearance, the last times I saw her, the investigations that had been stalled. I spoke of my helplessness, of the anguish of not knowing where she was or what had happened to her. When I finished, I felt empty, as if something had been ripped out of me. But I also felt a little more relieved, as if I had finally said what I had been holding back for months. After I finished, the moderator paused briefly, and then asked that we gather in small groups to talk further about our feelings and experiences. It was then that I noticed a man staring at me. He was at the far end of the room, sitting in a chair that almost looked like it was made for him. He was tall with dark hair, but his face was marked by something I couldn't identify. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't despair. It was something darker, something that made me uncomfortable. When his eyes met mine, I sensed something wasn't right. I decided I wouldn't watch him anymore, but I couldn't help it. During the whole session, I saw him move little, almost as if he was waiting for something. He was not the type of person to blend in with the group. Whenever someone shared something, he was silent, as if he was evaluating every word. There was something about his attitude that disturbed me. At the end of the session, as everyone began to get up to leave, the man approached me. He didn't say anything right away, just looked at me again with that penetrating gaze, as if he wanted to read my thoughts. His presence made me uncomfortable, but at the same time there was something about him that attracted me, an unhealthy curiosity, as if he knew something I did not. I couldn't help but think about him for days after the encounter. There was something unsettling about his calm, his presence. And then, as I was going over the notes from the meeting, I remembered something one of the participants had mentioned, something that had been left in the air, unexplained. He had spoken of a case, one involving a person who had disappeared under similar circumstances to my sister. The story had sounded familiar, but I failed to identify it at the time. It was only when I went back over the faces of the attendees and the details that I remembered. The man who had been watching me closely was related to that case. I decided to investigate further. His name was Victor Ledesma, or at least that's what the register of attendees said. I couldn't find out much about him at first, but enough to know that his face was not completely unfamiliar to me. Victor had been accused in the past of having a connection to several missing persons cases in the city, although the evidence was never conclusive. No one knew if he had really had anything to do with it, but the rumors about him had always been dark. Ledesma's name appeared in several news stories, on lists of people involved in unsolved investigations. The anguish I felt when I realized the connection between him and the group was so strong that I was tempted to leave the support group. But something stopped me. Something inside me urged me to keep going, to find out what else he knew. I needed answers, even if they were the scariest ones. The next day when I returned to the center, I looked for Victor. I found him in the same corner, alone, staring out the rain-fogged window. I did not approach, but watched him out of the corner of my eye, waiting for some sign, some action that would confirm my suspicions. The encounter was more tense than ever. The man seemed to be aware of my discomfort, as if he was waiting for someone to discover what was going on. I did not return to the group after that second meeting. The pressure on me increased with each passing minute, and I felt that the group was no longer a refuge but a trap. In the end, what had begun as an attempt to heal spiraled into despair. My own fears became more real, and the pieces of the puzzle fit together in a frightening way. I knew it as soon as I arrived at the next meeting, seeing his face in the crowd. Victor was not only linked to my sister, but to everyone in the group. His presence was no coincidence. He had been part of every case. He had left traces, and now we were all trapped. The road to my hometown seemed emptier than I remembered. The rain kept falling, and the constant sound of the drops hitting the windshield kept me alert, as the scenery on both sides of the road faded into the fog. I was returning after 20 years to a place I had sworn never to return. However, the call I received the day before compelled me to do so. The disappearance of my best friend, Marco, was something I never fully understood. I was 10 years old when he disappeared, and though the years passed, the mystery was never solved. It was a case that remained scarred in the city, an echo of something dark that no one dared to touch. When I left it behind, along with the promise to forget. But that call, in a voice I barely recognized, shook me. It told me that the time had come to know the truth. Marco had left traces that I never followed, and now it seemed it was time to face them. The city greeted me with its usual air of desolation. The narrow streets, the old and dilapidated houses, and the park where we used to play as children, everything looked the same. But at the same time, everything had changed. The scars of time were evident on every corner. The silence was heavier than ever. I decided to go to the place where it had all started, the park. It was a small, enclosed space surrounded by old trees, whose misshapen trunks seemed to hold secrets. This was where Marco disappeared. I remember the day with chilling clarity. We were playing near the creek, when suddenly I turned around and he was gone. No one else seemed to have seen him go, and when I looked for his trail, I found only a pair of footprints fading into the mud. I returned to the park out of habit, as if I were looking for something in the air, something to explain what had happened. I looked around, noting the broken benches, the fallen leaves, the musty smell. Everything looked the same, but somewhere deep inside me, something told me it was not. As I walked along the cobblestone path, I saw a man standing there, staring at the same tree Marco and I used to hide under. It was Javier, one of the friends I had as a child, the only one who seemed to know something more than the rest. His face, though aged, still retained that same look I could never understand, a mixture of guilt and resentment. I was not surprised to see him here. Javier had always been the one who talked the most about what happened with Marco, but his stories never seemed clear. There was always a veil of doubt in his voice. I approached him, but there was no need to speak. He already knew why I was there. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told me that he was finally willing to tell me what he had held back for so long. The conversation, or rather, what he was about to tell me, was brief, but it left scars. Javier told me about a series of events that up to that point had been completely unknown to me. Marco's disappearance had not been an accident, nor an escape. It had been part of something bigger, something that was woven between us children and the adults who lived in the city. It revealed to me that the friendship we shared, the trust we felt, had been manipulated by others. There was a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that had been developing in the shadows. Marco's disappearance had been the missing piece in a much darker game, and worst of all, No one wanted it to be known. No one wanted anyone to break the silence. Javier's words hit me like a wave. I couldn't fully process them, but I knew he was close to the truth. The city, which had once been a place full of laughter and play, was tainted by something else. Marco had been involved in something no one understood, something even he didn't know how to handle. And the adults, the ones who should have been responsible, were mixed up in the matter. Hearing this, I felt the air grow thicker, denser, as if something was about to explode. Javier, in a low voice, confessed to me that the key to everything was in Marco's diary, a diary that I had never seen and that no one else had wanted me to see. Javier had found it shortly after the disappearance, but something had stopped him. The need to protect himself, perhaps, or the fear of repercussions. Over the years, he had searched for answers, but had never found them. The authorities never investigated thoroughly, and rumors of what happened that day faded with time, like the echo of a cry lost in the fog. But now, something told me that the truth was much closer than I thought. Javier took me to his house, a house in ruins on the edge of the city. Inside, time had stopped, as if everything that had happened here had been frozen in the memories of that time. In the basement, hidden among boxes of old books, he found Marco's diary. It was covered in dust, but I recognized it immediately. I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a page that spoke of a secret meeting with someone in town, someone in a position of power. Marco had mentioned something about a transaction, a deal, something that had put his life in danger. The diary was full of details, little fragments that I couldn't fully understand at the time. There were notes that spoke of threats, of meetings in out-of-the-way places, and of an organization that moved in the shadows, with interests beyond what my mind could assimilate. Marco, it seemed, had begun to suspect something much bigger, and that had put him in danger. But the biggest find was a letter, written in hasty handwriting, in which Marco asked for help, not from us children, but from someone else, an adult who knew him well. That letter, written days before his disappearance, was the last clue. Suddenly, everything began to fit together, but at the same time it was getting scarier. Marco's disappearance was no accident, no runaway of a confused child. It was a deliberate act, a sacrifice in a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of the city. And worst of all, no one in the city wanted this to come to light. Marco had become a threat to them, and the only way to shut him up was to disappear him. With the diary in my hands, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let this go unnoticed. But at the same time, fear came over me. The web of deceit that had been waiting to be unveiled now included me. The same city that had been my home was now a dangerous place, where everything I knew was falling apart. As I left Javier's house with Marco's journal pressed against my chest, I felt that something had definitely broken inside me. The return to my hometown had not only been a trip to the past, it had been a condemnation to live with the truth. The city, with its rain-soaked streets, was not the place I had known. It was the scene of a hidden history, of a secret kept buried in the past but still echoing in the present. Marco had disappeared, but its truth was about to be revealed. And with it, the city would never be the same. I don't remember exactly when I started to feel that something wasn't right, but over time it became a persistent feeling, a pressure on my chest, a paranoia that I couldn't shake. It all started with a series of burglaries in the neighborhood. In the beginning, they were just small incidents, things you might think were coincidences, a poorly locked door, an open window that I didn't remember leaving that way. But as time went on, the frequency of the break-ins increased, and then I began to worry. It was a quiet neighborhood, mostly made up of families and a few older neighbors who didn't go out as much anymore. It was the kind of place where you could leave your keys under the rug or your doors unlocked and feel safe. But little things began to change. Visiting friends complained about the feeling of being watched. Dogs that used to bark normally at any noise were now silent, and the overall climate had changed. It was no longer a friendly place. So I made the decision to install security cameras. At first, I didn't take the whole surveillance thing very seriously. I saw it more as a preventative measure. I bought a system of discrete cameras, those that can be installed in any corner of the house without being obvious, but that can record every detail. As the days went by, I forgot about them. The cameras were installed and I felt safe, but the discomfort never went away. It was a rainy night when something made me review the recordings. There were a couple of incidents during the week, some doors that felt weird, a light that went out on its own, and a couple of strange noises in the backyard. I thought it was the wind, the poor condition of the facilities, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, after a particularly unsettling afternoon, I decided to sit down in front of the monitor and review the recordings. What I found chilled my blood. The cameras I had installed not only captured what was going on inside the house, but also recorded the outside, including the entire perimeter of the property. The first recording didn't catch my attention. It was just a sequence of lights flickering from the rain. But it was in the next recording that I saw something that left me transfixed. In the backyard, a man was standing by the fence surrounding my house. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, motionless, watching the house. His presence was not evident at first glance, but as I zoomed in on the file, I could make out his figure, fuzzy at first but recognizable. He was dressed in a long coat and a cap. His face was partially covered, but it was the eyes that disturbed me. They did not move. They were fixed on some point inside the house, as if he could see through the walls. There was no reason for that person to be there. No one had walked through that area of the house all day. I decided to move forward in the recording. I could see that after a while the stranger approached the back door of the house. He did not attempt to enter, he simply observed. His demeanor was unsettling, as if he was waiting for something, as if he was in no hurry to leave, even though the rain was falling heavily on his body. As the minutes passed, something about his attitude made me more nervous. I could see how he slowly turned his head, almost as if he was making sure he was not seen, but at no time did he move away. On the contrary, he remained there, in the gloom, until the image was cut off for a couple of seconds due to the interference of the bad weather. Then it reappeared, but it was no longer near the back door. Now, it was on the side of the house, right in front of one of the main living room windows. Worst of all, this time he was not only watching, but he seemed to be touching the window. I couldn't see his hands, but the movement of his figure suggested that he was manipulating something. I couldn't see it clearly, but the way it approached and the way it touched the surface of the window filled me with terror. What puzzled me most was not the figure itself, but the feeling that something had been going on long before I realized it. This man had been stalking my home for days, perhaps weeks, and I had had no idea. The paranoia, which had been growing in me for no apparent reason, now had tangible confirmation. With my heart pounding, I decided I should go out and check. I was sure that what I had seen on the recording was not a figment of my imagination. I looked out the window of the main room, the same one the man had been watching, but saw nothing. I couldn't go outside, not yet. Instead, I stood there, watching the remaining footage, looking for more details. There was something about his movements, something that didn't fit, but I couldn't figure out exactly what.